Hey guys, tonight we are going to gently, and perhaps a little disgustingly, dismantle everything you thought you knew about pirates. We're setting sail for the Golden Age of Piracy, but we're leaving the Hollywood romance, the swashbuckling charm, and the suspiciously clean bandanas on the dock. Instead, you're getting a one-way ticket to the real thing, a world where you'd be lucky to survive the first week, let alone find any treasure. It's a journey into a floating world of grime, sickness, and questionable life choices. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps the channel more than you know. And as you settle in, drop a comment letting me know what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. I love seeing where these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The salt spray feels cool on your face, a welcome relief from the humid, sticky air of the port town you just left behind. For a moment, it's exactly like the adventure stories you imagined. The rhythmic creak of the ship's timbers, the snap of the wind in the heavy canvas sails, the endless blue horizon stretching out before you. You made it. You're free from the drudgery of land, a new member of a brotherhood bound for fortune and glory. You take a deep, satisfying breath of sea air and wait, hold on. That's not quite right. Mixed with the clean, briny scent of the ocean is something else, something heavy, sour, and deeply unpleasant. You can't quite place it, but it clings to the back of your throat. You try to ignore it as you take your first real look at your new home. From the dock, the ship looked majestic, a promise of power and freedom. Up close, it's weathered, and that's being generous. The wood of the deck is dark and stained with things you don't want to identify. A fine layer of grime seems to cover every surface, turning the ropes a dingy gray and the wood a spline ray, mottled brown. There's a general state of disrepair that suggests function is the only thing that matters here. Aesthetics died along, slow death weeks ago. Before you can dwell on it, a man with a booming voice, the quartermaster, you learn is gathering all the new hands. He unrolls a piece of parchment on a barrel head that serves as a makeshift table. This, he announces, is the ship's articles, the code. This is the moment where the pirate fantasy collides with some surprisingly organized paperwork. This is a mainstream historical fact that often gets glossed over in the movies. Most pirate ships operated under a strict set of rules, agreed upon and signed by every crew member. It laid out the distribution of plunder, a full share for you, a share and a half for the quartermaster, 2 for the captain, the rules of engagement, and, most importantly, a detailed compensation plan for injuries. Lose a right arm, you get 600 pieces of 8. And 100 pieces of 8 and the promise of a cool-looking Aipcha. Probably. You watch as the men line up. Some scrawl their names with practiced ease. Others, and this is where it gets interesting, hesitate. A surprising number of sailors in the 17th and 18th centuries were illiterate. So, what did they do? This is a little-known detail. They would simply make their mark. An X, a crude drawing of a fish, or some other personal symbol would be drawn next to their printed name, witnessed and verified by a literate crewmate. You see a burly man with a tangled beard carefully dip the quill in ink, only to draw a lopsided star. That star is now his legally binding signature in this floating, lawless society. You step up, sign your own name, and feel a strange sense of belonging. It's a democracy of thieves. But as you look from the captain to the quartermaster, you can't help but wonder about the true nature of this contract. And here's something historians still debate to this day: were these pirate articles a genuine expression of a revolutionary, democratic spirit, a social contract for outcasts, or were they just a brutally pragmatic management tool, designed to keep a ship full of heavily armed, greedy men from turning on each other before they found any loot? Was it about liberty? Or was it just about preventing a knife fight over the first barrel of rum? The answer is probably a messy combination of both. As you step back, the signing complete, You are officially one of them, a pirate. The initial thrill returns, but it's tempered by the reality around you. The ship groans again, the long, low sound like a dying beast. The men around you are laughing and talking, but their faces are gaunt, their skin sallow, and that smell, it's stronger now. It's a complex bouquet of unwashed bodies, stale booze, bilge water, and something vaguely like rot. You've just signed your life away, and you're beginning to suspect that the promise of gold was only part of the story. The other part is written in the grime under your feet and carried on the very air you breathe. That smell. Let's go back to that smell. It's not just a single note, it's a full, overwhelming chord of foulness, and your nose, still accustomed to the relatively clean air of land, is trying to dissect it. The first layer is undeniably human. Imagine 100 or so men, packed into a wooden vessel maybe 100 feet long. Now imagine they are performing hard, physical labor under the hot sun, hauling ropes, climbing rigging, swabbing decks. They are sweating profusely. And now, for the grand finale, imagine they do this day after day without ever changing their clothes or taking a proper bath. The resulting aroma is a thick, sour miasma of stale sweat, body oils, and unwashed hair that seems to have its own physical weight. It follows every crew member like a personal cloud, and when they gather together, it merges into a suffocating fog. You try to find a corner of the deck where the wind is fresh, but it's no use. The breeze simply picks up the collective odor of the crew and delivers it directly to you. But that's just the top note. Underneath the human musk, there's something deeper, something elemental to the ship itself. It's the smell of the bilge. The bilge is the lowest part of the ship's hull, an internal space that's essentially the ship's gutter. Everything finds its way down there. Seawater that leaks through the planks, spilled rum, greasy residue from the cook's galley, rats that didn't make it, and any other unmentionable fluids. It all collects into a stagnant, black soup that sloshes back and forth with the motion of the ship. Periodically, the crew has to pump it out, a truly gag-inducing task. The pump brings up bucket after bucket of this vile liquid, splashing it across the deck and releasing a stench so potent it could knock a seagull out of the sky. The smell of the bilge is the smell of decay itself, sulfuric, swampy, and absolute. This is a well-documented piece of maritime life. The horror of the bilge was a universal constant for sailors of this era. It was considered one of the most disgusting, undangerous parts of the ship, a breeding ground for disease and a source of perpetual olfactory misery. But the symphony of smells continues. You catch a whiff of something else, the faint but unmistakable scent of livestock, tucked away in a corner of the deck. You see a small pen with a few scrawny chickens and a goat, their waist adding a sharp, ammonial like tang to the air. They are the ship's emergency food supply, and their presence turns a small section of your new home into a floating barnyard. Mixed with this is the smell of the ship's provisions, barrels of salted beef and pork, which after weeks at sea begin to take on a rancid, slightly off odor, sacks of flour and hardtack biscuit, which absorb the damp sea air and develop a musty, moldy scent. The entire vessel is a closed system, a self-contained ecosystem of filth, and every single thing within it contributes to the overall perfume. Now for a peculiar little detail you wouldn't expect. Amidst all this rot, there is one sharp, almost chemical smell that cuts through the other's tar. The ship's ropes and the seams between its wooden planks are coated in a thick, black paint to make them waterproof and to prevent rot. This tar is everywhere. It gets on your hands when you grab a rope. It stains your clothes if you lean against the railing, and its acrid scent permeates everything. In a strange way, the smell of tar was the lesser of two evils. It was a clean, industrial smell compared to the biological decay surrounding you. Some sailors might have even found it reassuring. A sign that the ship was being maintained and wasn't about to fall apart. It was the unofficial and deeply unpleasant air freshener of the 18th century seas. And this leads to a question that historians and archaeologists still ponder just how much did this constant, overwhelming stench actually bother the pirates on one hand. You have personal accounts and naval records from the period that complain bitterly about the foul air below decks, linking it directly to sickness and low morale. This suggests they were very much aware of how disgusting their environment was. On the other hand, the human sense of smell is incredibly adaptive. After weeks at sea, did they simply become nose-blind to it all? Some scholars argue that the baseline for what was considered a bad smell in the 18th century was so vastly different from our modern, sanitized world that they might have just accepted it as a normal part of life. No more remarkable than the sound of the waves. It's a debate about perception versus reality. Was it a constant, conscious misery, or just the unremarkable background scent of their daily existence? For you, however, it's not the background, it's the foreground. It's the only thing you can focus on. Every breath is a reminder of where you are. There is no escape. You are trapped in a bubble of foul air, floating on an endless ocean. The romance of the sea is already fading, replaced by a much more visual and much smellier reality. As you try to discreetly breathe through your mouth, you start to take a closer look at your new shipmates. They are a motley collection, to be sure, drawn from every corner of the Atlantic world. Deserters from the Royal Navy, former merchant sailors, escaped servants, and hardened criminals, all thrown together by a shared desire for a life outside the law. But it's not their origins that strike you, it's the condition they're in. They look used, hard used, like pieces of equipment that have been left out in the rain for too long. You see a man leaning against the mainmast, his face a roadmap of hardship. His skin is leathery and cracked from sun and wind, with a deep tan that stops abruptly at his neckline. But it's his smile that truly captivates you, and not in a good way. As he laughs at a joke, you see that his mouth is a collection of gaps and blackened stumps. A few lonely, yellowed teeth stand their ground, but their gums are a puffy, angry reed. This isn't the result of a bar fight, it's a gallery of decay, a testament to a life without anything resembling dental hygiene. Sugar, a luxury becoming more common thanks to the very trade routes they plunder, was rotting the teeth of Europe, and pirates were no exception. They chew on tobacco, but the idea of brushing was utterly alien. Then you notice his hands. The knuckles are swollen and scarred. The fingernails are thick, yellowed, and caked with grime and tar. One finger is missing its top joint, a clean, old amputation. As you look around, you see this is the norm. Missing fingers, deep, poorly healed scars, and a general air of physical ruin are as common as tattoos. These men are walking advertisements for the dangers of their profession. A slip on a wet deck, a mishandled cannon, a moment of carelessness in a storm, all could lead to a permanent, disfiguring injury. This brings us to a major historical point about pirates. Their careers were almost always brutally short. The romantic image is of a pirate sailing for decades, growing old and wise in his villainy. The reality was that the combination of disease, dangerous work, combat, and harsh living conditions meant that the average pirate was lucky to last a few years. A man in his late 20s was often considered a seasoned veteran, and anyone pushing 40 was an ancient relic. As you continue your survey, you notice something else. A man is sitting on a coil of rope, methodically scratching his arm, then his side, then his neck. He does it with a practiced, abstinent rhythm, as if it's a part of his normal breathing. His skin is covered in small, red sores, some of which are weeping a clear fluid. You found the ship's unofficial mascot, the louse, but we'll get to know him much more intimately later. Now for a strange little detail that adds another layer of misery to their appearance. Look at their eyes. You'll notice many of them are bloodshot, with a yellowish tinge to the whites. This could be from any number of things: exhaustion, liver damage from excessive drinking, or the early stages of diseases like yellow fever. But one common cause was simply the smoke. Below decks, where the crew ate and slept, the only light came from flickering, smoky lanterns that used foul-smelling animal fat or fish oil for fuel. The air in these cramped, unventilated spaces was thick with certain smoke. Living in that environment day and night would leave your eyes perpetually irritated on dread, contributing to that classic, haggard pirate look. It wasn't just a life of adventure, it was a life of constant, low-grade smoke inhalation. The physical state of these men raises a complex and still debated question among historians. What was their life expectancy really like compared to their honest, law-abiding counterparts in, say, the Royal Navy or the Merchant Marine? The common assumption is that a pirate's life was far deadlier. They engaged in combat more frequently and didn't have access to even the rudimentary medical care available on a naval vessel. However, some scholars argue that the opposite might be true, at least in some respects. Pirates often ate better, at least initially, after a prize was taken, worked fewer hours when not in pursuit of a ship, and had a greater say in their working conditions. Naval sailors, by contrast, were subject to brutal discipline, including flogging, and were often malnourished on meager, states ancient rations. So, who was more likely to die young, the free-living but reckless pirate, or the oppressed but more orderly naval seaman? The data is sparse and the debate continues, a morbid accounting of which hell was worse. For now, you're just surrounded by the evidence. Scars, sores, missing teeth, and a pervasive sense of exhaustion hang over the crew. These aren't the dashing rogues of storybooks. They are broken, weary men. As one of them catches your eye, he gives you a gap-toothed grin. "Welcome aboard, lad," he rasps, his voice hoarse. You force a smile back, but a cold thought enters your mind. Is this what you're going to look like in a year? The prospect is more terrifying than any naval cannon. Your stomach rumbles, a hollow echo against the creaking of the ship. It's been hours since you left port. Then the initial excitement, now soured by the smells and sights, has given way to a basic, gnawing hunger. Just as you begin to wonder what a pirate eats, the call goes out from the cook. The men, who had been lounging and mending ropes, suddenly stir with a renewed energy. They form a line, tin plates and mugs in hand. You grab the plate you were issued a dented, greasy piece of pewter and get in line. The cook, a one-eyed man with forearms like cured hands, stands over a large, steaming pot. He slops a ladle, if you will, of a grayish, lumpy stew onto your plate. You can identify some potatoes and what might be salted beef, all swimming in a thin, oily gravy. It doesn't look appetizing, but it smells better than the bilge, so you're not about to complain. Alongside the stew, he tosses a couple of large, off-white discs onto your plate. They look like oversized, petrified crackers. This is it. This is your introduction to the cornerstone of the seafaring diet, hardtack. Also known as ship's biscuit. Hardtack was the 18th century equivalent of an energy bar, but with a shelf life that could be measured in years, if not decades. The recipe was simple: flour, water, maybe a little salt, baked into a dense, moisture-free cracker. The result was a food product, so hard you could probably use it to sand the deck. It was a logistical miracle, a way to carry carbohydrates for long voyages without worrying about mold. At least, that was the theory. You sit down on a barrel, eager to eat. You try to take a bite of the hardtack. It's like biting a rock. Your teeth ache with the effort, and you've barely made a dent. You watch the veteran sailors around you. They don't bite it directly. Instead, they smack it hard against the edge of a table or the mast, breaking it into smaller, more manageable chunks. Then, they dunk the pieces into their stew, their grog, or even their water, letting it soften for a few minutes until it reaches the consistency of a damp piece of wood. You follow their lead, breaking off a corner and dropping it into your stew. As it soaks, you notice one of the older pirates doing something strange. HES, holding his own piece of hardtack over his plate and tapping it rhythmically with his knife. You lean closer to see what HES doing, and then you see them. Little black things, no bigger than a grain of rice, are falling out of the holes in the biscuit and onto his plate. They are weevils. Your hardtack is infested. This is a quintessential and absolutely true part of the sailor's experience. Hardtack was notoriously prone to infestation by flour, weevils, and maggots. The eggs were often already in the flour before it was even baked. After a few weeks at sea, in the damp, warm hold of the ship, they would hatch. Sailors had a grimly humorous name for them: weevil castles. They didn't see it as the food being spoiled, they just saw it as having a little extra unwanted protein. The common wisdom was to eat in the dark, so you couldn't see what you were putting in your mouth. Tapping the biscuit was the more refined method, a way to dislodge the worst of the inhabitants before you ate. Some sailors joked that it was better to have the weevils than the maggots, because at least the weevils would crawl away from the light. And here's a quirky little fact about this buggy bred. The weevils, scientifically known as Pseudophilus granarius, weren't just a nuisance, they could actually hollow out the biscuit from the inside, leaving it a fragile shell. So, a sailor might pick up what looks like a solid piece of hardtack, only to have it crumble into a puff of dust and insects in his hand. Imagine the disappointment. It was a constant battle between man and bug over who got to eat the flour. You look down at your own stew, where your piece of hardtack is now turning into a soggy mush. You can't tell if the little dark specks floating in the gravy are pepper or something else. At this point, you're too hungry to care. You fish out a piece with your spoon and eat it. It's bland, chewy, and tastes vaguely of dust, but it fills the emptiness in your stomach. This whole disgusting buffet leads to a debate that maritime historians and food scientists have had for years: just how nutritious, or even edible, was this food on paper. A diet of salted meat and hardtack provides protein and carbohydrates, but the salting process for the meat destroyed many vitamins, and the quality was often appalling to begin with. Sometimes it was horse meat, and sometimes it was so old it was literally petrified. The hardtack, as you've just discovered, was often compromised. Some historians argue that this diet was a slow-motion disaster, inevitably leading to the malnutrition that made diseases like scurvy so deadly. Others contend that, when supplemented with fresh fish when they could catch and whatever fresh provisions could be plundered from other ships, it was a sustainable, if unappetizing, way to survive. They argue that pirate crews, who could pick and choose from the cargo of captured vessels, likely ate far better than their naval counterparts, feasting on sugar, spices, and wine meant for wealthy merchants. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in the messy, weevil-infested middle. You finish your stew, trying not to think about its ingredients, both intentional and unintentional. You've had your first meal as a pirate. It was grim, it was buggy, and it was deeply unsatisfying. And as the cook starts cleaning his pot, you realize with a sinking feeling that you'll be eating this, or some variation of it, every single day for the foreseeable future. Suddenly, the treasure at the end of this journey seems very, very far away. With your stomach now uneasily full of stew and weevils, you feel a powerful thirst. The salty beef has left a dry, clinging residue in your mouth, and all you can think about is a long, cool drink of water. You see a large wooden barrel, or cask, lashed near the mainmast. It has a spigot, and a few tin cups hang from nails driven into the wood beside it. This must be the water supply. Simple enough. You grab a cup and head over. A veteran sailor, seeing your intention, puts a hand on your shoulder. Easy there, lad. He grunts. Don't go wasting it. Wasting it, it's just water. But you nod and proceed with more caution. You turn the spigot, and a trickle of brownish-yellow liquid dribbles into your cup. It's not exactly the crystal-clear spring water you were hoping for. You hold it up to your nose. It has a faint, swampy odor, like a pond in late summer. Still, It's water. You take a sip. The taste is alive. It's thick, slightly slimy, and has a distinct flavor of wood, algae, and something else you can't quite name but instinctively know is rot. You sit down, your throat contracting in protest. You look inside your cup and see a thin, greenish film clinging to the sides. This is the water you'll be drinking for the next several weeks. This is a fundamental truth of the age of sail fresh. Potable water was the single most precious and problematic resource on any long voyage. It was more valuable than gold, more critical than rum. Your ship's range wasn't determined by how much food you had, but by how much water you could carry. The problem was keeping it fresh. Wooden casks were the best technology they had, but they were far from perfect. The wood itself would leach tannins into the water, turning it brown and bitter. Worse, the water wasn't sterile. It was teeming with microorganisms from the source. And in the dark, warm confines of a cask, these algae, bacteria, and fungi would have a party. Within a few weeks, a cask of fresh water would transform into a stinking, slime-filled culture. Sailors called it ropey or stringy because of the long, gelatinous strands of algae that would form within it. To make it even remotely palatable, sailors developed various techniques. Sometimes they would add a bit of vinegar or citrus juice, if they had any, which would kill some of the bacteria and mask the taste. The most common method, however, was to simply mix it with alcohol, creating grog, a topic we'll dive into soon. But for now, you're faced with the raw material. And here's a wonderfully disgusting little nugget of historical trivia for you. How did they try to keep the water fresh for longer? One popular and utterly ineffective method was to drop a handful of iron nails into the cask. The theory, based on some long-forgotten folk wisdom, was that the iron would somehow purify the water. It didn't. Another, slightly more effective method was charring the inside of the cask. This process, which is still used in making whiskey barrels today, would create a layer of charcoal that could act as a crude filter, absorbing some of the impurities and off-tastes. It helped, but it was no match for a determined colony of algae. Sometimes, they'd even find mosquito larvae, known as wriggle RS, swimming in their daily ration. Like the weevils in the hardtack, many sailors just chose to view it as extra nutrition. As you stand there, contemplating a second cup of this swamp water, you realize the immense strategic importance of this foul-tasting liquid. A ship's entire itinerary could revolve around finding a place to weigh water. Islands that had fresh springs or rivers were marked on charts like treasure hoards. When a pirate ship captured another vessel, one of the first things they would plunder wasn't the gold or the cargo, but the water casks. Taking another ship's water was a way to extend their own operational range and, simultaneously, cripple their victims. This desperation for water is a subject of some academic debate. Historians argue over the true impact of water quality on crew health. Traditionally, the focus has been on the more dramatic diseases like scurvy or yellow fever. But how many sailors died from less glamorous ailments caused directly by contaminated water? Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, all waterborne diseases were rampant. Some historians argue that the constant, low-grade poisoning from putrid water was one of the biggest killers on the high seas, responsible for weakening the crew's immune systems and making them more susceptible to everything else. Others maintain that the human gut at the time was simply more robust, accustomed to a level of bacteria that would hospitalize a modern person. They suggest that while unpleasant, the water wasn't the primary cause of death, but rather a contributing factor. We lack the precise medical records to settle the matter, leaving us to wonder just how deadly that slimy cup of water truly was. You decide to pass on that second cup for now. You can still feel the first one sitting in your stomach. A cool, sloshing reminder of your body's most basic and now most vulnerable need. You look out at the vast, endless saltwater ocean surrounding you. The irony is staggering. You are surrounded by water, but you might die of thirst. The adventure is getting grimmer by the hour. Your throat is still a desert, and the memory of that slimy water makes you hesitant to go back for more. You see the other pirates, however, looking quite cheerful. They're not lining up at the water cask. Instead, they're gathered around another barrel, from which the quartermaster is dispensing their daily ration of something else. He is pouring a measure of dark liquid from a jug into each man's cup, then topping it off with a ladle FUL of that same questionable water you just sampled. The men take their cups and drink with gusto. This, you realize, is the famous pirate beverage of choice. But it's probably not what you think it is. While we imagine pirates constantly swigging from bottles of rum, the daily drink for most sailors of this era, pirates included, was something a bit more diluted and, frankly, more practical. Often, it was beer, but not the crisp, hoppy stuff you might be imagining. It was small beer, a wheat, low-alcohol brew that was one of the first things to be consumed on a voyage because it went bad relatively quickly. Once the beer was gone, they moved on to the harder stuff, mixed with water. This concoction was famously known in the Royal Navy as grog. The name came from Admiral Edward Vernon, nicknamed Old Grog because of the Jerogan cloak he wore. In 1740, he ordered that the sailors' daily rum ration be diluted with water to cut down on drunkenness. Pirates, being their own masters, didn't have to follow naval orders, but they adopted a similar practice out of sheer necessity. This is the key historical point. Drinking diluted alcohol wasn't just about getting drunk, it was a public health measure. The alcohol, even when diluted, acted as a disinfectant, killing some of the nasty bacteria and microorganisms thriving in the slimy water casks. It also, quite obviously, made the foul-tasting water much more palatable. A cup of grog, or whatever the pirates called their version of it, was safer and tastier than a cup of straight water. In this world, alcohol was literally the life of the party, and potentially a lifesaver. You get your own ration. The rum is harsh and dry, tasting of molasses and fire, mixed with the swampy water. It creates a beverage that is simultaneously sweet, foul, and potent. You take a tentative sip. It's not good, but it's a definite improvement. The alcoholic burn momentarily erases the slimy texture of the water. Then you can feel a pleasant warmth spreading through your chest. Now you understand. This isn't just about recreation, it's about hydration. Now for a weird little fact about the pirates' drink of choice. Well, rum, made from fermented sugarcane byproducts in the Caribbean, is the most famous pirate liquor. Their tastes were actually quite eclectic and depended entirely on what they could steal. If they captured a ship sailing from France, they'd be drinking brandy and wine for weeks. If they took a vessel from the American colonies, they might end up with barrels of hard cider or even whiskey. Some of the most prized alcoholic beverages were fortified wines like Madeira and port from Spanish or Portuguese ships. These wines traveled well and were incredibly valuable. So, a pirate's cup could contain anything from the crudest, cheapest rum to the most expensive European vintages. They were equal opportunity drinkers. Their bar was stocked by their victims. The men around you are getting louder, their spirits lifted by the daily tot. The grog loosens their tongues and eases the aches of the day's labor. It's a moment of community, a shared ritual in a life of hardship, but it also highlights a serious problem. The line between medicinal necessity and debilitating alcoholism was incredibly thin, and most of these men trampled right over it. While a daily ration of grog might have been a sensible policy, pirates had access to entire barrels of the stuff. After a successful raid, they would often drink themselves into a stupor for days on end, leaving the ship vulnerable and their own health in shambles. This leads to a debate that historians of medicine and culture still tangle with. Was the rampant alcoholism among pirates a cause or a symptom of their lifestyle? One school of thought argues that it was a primary driver of their dysfunction. Alcoholism led to poor decision-making, violent outbursts, and a neglect of duties that ultimately contributed to the short, chaotic nature of the Golden Age. It was a pathology that doomed them. But another perspective sees the heavy drinking as a rational, if tragic, form of self-medication for men living in constant filth, with the daily threat of death from disease, accident, or violence, and with no hope for a peaceful retirement. Drinking to excess was a way to cope with the physical pain and psychological trauma of their existence. Was it a weakness of character, or a predictable response to an unbearable reality? Were they drinking because they were pirates? Or were they pirates because they were drinking? The answer is likely as messy as the bottom of a rum barrel. You finish your cup of grog, your thirst is quenched, and the grim reality of your surroundings feels slightly less oppressive. The world has softened at the edges. For a brief moment, you feel like you belong, a part of this rough, loud brotherhood. But as you watch a man stumble back to the barrel for an unauthorized second round, you realize that this comforting warmth is a double-edged sword. It makes the life bearable, but it also fuels the very recklessness and decay that will almost certainly bring it to a premature end. The grog, for all its dubious benefits, is now working its way through your system. Nature calls. You look around the deck, trying to figure out the procedure. You don't see any doors marked restroom or head. You quietly ask one of your more approachable-looking crewmates where a man goes to relieve himself. He laughs, a wheezing, gap-toothed chuckle, and points towards the very front of the ship. The bow. Go make your peace with Neptune, he says, and turns back to his conversation. Confused, you make your way forward. The front of a sailing ship, the part that cuts through the waves, is called the bow. The very tip of it is the prow, which on a large ship often juts out over the water. Below the prow is a tangle of nets and wooden gratings known as the beakhead, or more simply, the head. This area, exposed to the wind and sea, was the designated toilet for the entire crew. There were no stalls, no privacy, and no toilet paper. There was only you, the open ocean, and the precarious perch. You climb out onto the grating, clinging to a rope for balance. The ship is pitching and rolling in the waves, and the sea churns just a few feet below you. This is it. You have to undo your trousers and position yourself over the water, all while holding on for dear life, to avoid being pitched into the drink. The wind is brisk and decidedly unhelpful. It's a terrifying and dignified and acrobatic experience. As you finish, you understand the system's one brutal advantage. The waves that splash up against the bow act as a natural, if forceful, bite-out. It's a self-cleaning toilet, in the most literal sense. This is the origin of the naval term for a toilet, the head. It's a well-established piece of maritime history, born from pure, stark functionality. Now, imagine doing this in a store. Imagine the ship bucking like a wild animal, with freezing waves crashing over the bow. A simple trip to the bathroom could easily become a fatal accident. Falling overboard was a death sentence. The ship wouldn't and often couldn't turn around for one man. This daily, necessary act was a constant reminder of the fragility of your life at sea. But here's a quirky and slightly less disgusting detail about the ship's sanitation. What about the captain? Surely the man in charge didn't have to risk his life on the open air head with the common sailors. And you'd be right. The captain enjoyed the height of onboard luxury, a private toilet in the stern, the back of the ship, usually as part of the captain's quarters. There would be a small closet built out over the ship's side. Inside was a wooden bench with a hole in it, a potty chair that emptied directly into the sea. These little outcroppings are often visible in detailed ship models and paintings, known as the quarter galleries. They often had windows, making them perhaps the most scenic toilets in the world. This was one of the great privileges of command, the ability to answer nature's call in private and relative safety. This stark difference in bathroom facilities, the communal, dangerous head for the crew and the private, secure toilet for the captain, was a standard feature on naval and merchant ships. But on a pirate ship, it creates an interesting dynamic. Pirate society prided itself on its democratic nature and the limited power of the captain. The captain was elected, could be voted out, and only had absolute authority during a battle. So, this raises a question that historians of pirate culture still debate: did the pirate captain get to keep his private toilet? Some argue that in the spirit of egalitarianism, a pirate crew might have insisted that the captain use the head just like everyone else. Forcing the captain to share in this daily indignity would be a powerful symbol of their revolutionary ideals. It would be a statement that on this ship, no man is above another. Others argue for pragmatism. The captain was the ship's most vital navigator and tactical leader. Risking his life just to prove a point would be colossally stupid. A captain swept overboard by a wave while using the head would doom the entire enterprise. Therefore, the crew would have likely allowed him to use the safer, private facilities in the stern, seeing it not as a privilege of rank, an officer's perk, but as a sensible precaution to protect a valuable asset. The historical record is largely silent on this specific point of pirate etiquette, leaving us to imagine the heated debates that might have taken place over who gets to use the good toilet. As you make your way back from the head, feeling both relieved and deeply humbled, you have a newfound appreciation for the simple act of closing a bathroom door. That smell we discussed earlier, you now understand another major component of it. The prevailing winds would often carry the scent from the head back along the length of the ship, a constant, faint reminder of the ship's primitive plumbing. You are living, sleeping, and eating in a giant, floating outhouse. The romance is well and truly gone now, washed away by the cold, salty splash of reality. Now that you've managed the basics of eating, drinking, and other bodily functions, you start to think about more mundane aspects of existence, like your clothes. You're wearing a simple linen shirt, woolen breeches, and stocking standard sailor's garb. After just a couple of days of hauling terry ropes and sweating under the sun, they are already stiff with salt, stained with food, and starting to develop a distinct aroma of their own, a personal contribution to the ship's overall bouquet. You wonder when laundry day is. The answer, you will soon discover, is never. You look around at the other pirates. Their clothes are in a state of advanced decay. They are patched, ray-patched, and stained with every substance the ship has to offer: tar, fish guts, rum, grease, and things too horrifying to contemplate. The colors have faded to a universal palette of grime, brown, and sweat gray. Seams are giving way, and fabric has been worn so thin in places that it's nearly transparent. This isn't a fashion statement. It's not the distressed look people pay extra for today. It's the result of a simple, brutal calculation. There is no fresh water to spare for washing clothes. Every drop of that slimy, precious water in the casks is allocated for drinking, or, more accurately, for mixing with grog. Using it to wash a shirt would be seen as an act of incredible wastefulness, perhaps even a crime against the ship. A man who washed his breeches with drinking water would be lucky to get away with a simple keel hauling. This is a core historical fact of life at sea. Laundry, as we know it, was a luxury reserved for long stays in port. At sea, you wore your clothes until they literally disintegrated off your body. When a shirt or a pair of trousers became too rotten to patch, you simply threw them overboard and acquired new ones. Acquired is the key word here. A pirate's wardrobe was sorted from two places: the clothes they had on when they joined the crew, and the chests of sailors on captured ships. When a prize was taken, the pirates would swarm aboard and, after securing the vessel, would loot it for anything of value. This included the personal belongings of the captured crew. A fresh, clean shirt or a sturdy pair of boots was a valuable piece of plunder, often claimed by the first man to lay hands on it. Your next outfit was waiting for you on the back of some unfortunate merchant sailor you were about to meet. This brings us to a peculiar little detail about pirate fashion. We have this image, largely from movies, of pirates wearing flamboyant, brightly colored coats, sashes, and bandanas. While some of it is exaggeration, there's a kernel of truth. If a pirate crew captured a wealthy merchant or a passenger ship, they might come across trunks filled with fine clothing, silk vests, lace cuffs, velvet coats. What would a pirate do with a ridiculously impractical, bright red silk coat? He'd wear it. Why? Because he could. It was a status symbol, a way of literally wearing your success. It was a defiant gesture against the drab, uniform-like clothing of the naval and merchant services they had escaped. So you would have this bizarre spectacle of a man in a filthy, disintegrating pair of trousers and a tattered shirt, topped with a magnificent, stolen velvet coat. It was the ultimate high-low fashion, a walking contradiction of poverty and plunder. Of course, these fine clothes would quickly succumb to the same harsh realities as everything else. The silk would be stained with tar, the lace would be torn on a splintered rail, and the velvet would soon smell just as bad as the man wearing it. The question of what pirates really wore is a subject of ongoing discussion among historians and reenactors. The traditional view, supported by some contemporary accounts and engravings, is that they dressed just like any other sailor, loose-fitting trousers or breeches, simple shirts, and perhaps a waistcoat or jacket. Their clothes were practical and durable. The more revisionist view, however, argues that we underestimate their love of flash. These were men who lived outside the rigid social structures of the time, and their clothing was a way to express their individuality and anti-authoritarian spirit. This school of thought points to records of captured pirates who were found with surprisingly luxurious items in their sea chests. Was the typical pirate drab, practical seaman, or a flamboyant fashion rebel? The truth is likely that it varied wildly from one pirate to another. For every man who just wanted a dry pair of stockings, there was another who dreamed of finding a hat with a magnificent ostrich feather. You look down at your own clothes, feeling the stiff, salt-impregnated fabric chafe against your skin. You realize your shirt is not just a piece of clothing, it's a finite resource. You have to make it last. You will wear it through sun and storm, through work and sleep. It will become a second skin, a repository of every meal you spill and every rope you handle. It will be your constant, grimy companion on this journey. The idea of feeling clean and comfortable again seems like a distant, impossible dream, a memory from a life you left behind on the shore. The feeling of being perpetually grimy begins to wear on you. It's not just your clothes, it's your skin. A sticky film of salt, sweat, and airborne filth covers you from head to toe. Your hair is stiff and greasy. You crave the simple sensation of soap and clean water, a feeling you once took for granted. You see the endless ocean surrounding you and have a seemingly brilliant idea why not just take a bath in the sea. It's an infinite bathtub, right there at your disposal. You mention this idea to a fellow crewman, who looks at you as if you've suggested setting the sails on fire. Go on then, if you've got a death wish, he snorts. He then explains the grim reality of your brilliant idea. First, there's the obvious danger of sharks, which were known to follow ships for days, drawn by the refuse and garbage tossed overboard. But the more immediate problem is the water itself. Bathing in salt water is a profoundly unsatisfying experience. You can't use soap, because soap doesn't lather in salt water. It just turns into a scummy, useless mess. So you're essentially just rinsing yourself with more water. But the real issue comes after you get out. As the seawater on your skin evaporates, it leaves behind a crusty, crystalline layer of salt. This salt deposit chafes. It gets into every little cut, scrape, and insect bite, causing a constant, agonizing stinging sensation. It also draws moisture out of your skin, leaving it dry, cracked, and irritated. Far from making you feel clean, a salt water bath leaves you feeling itchy, sticky, and more uncomfortable than you were before. You'd be trading a layer of grime for a layer of abrasive salt. This is a fundamental piece of nautical knowledge. The sea is for sailing on, not for bathing in. The only time a sailor might get a freshwater rinse was during a rainstorm. When a squall hit, some men would strip off their clothes and stand on the deck, letting the rain wash away weeks of accumulated filth. It was a rare, celebrated event of free shower from the heavens. But these moments were fleeting and unpredictable. For the most part, You simply had to get used to being dirty. This constant state of filth leads to a curious and rather unpleasant medical phenomenon. Let's talk about boils and skin infections. With your skin perpetually damp, salty, and covered in tiny abrasions from rough ropes and splintered wood, it becomes a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Small cuts that would be trivial on land can become raging infections at sea. The most common affliction was the saltwater boil painful, pus-filled abscesses that could pop up anywhere on the body. They were a constant misery for sailors, and a pirate, with no access to medical care, could be laid low for weeks by a particularly bad one. It was a very real and very painful occupational hazard. This is where a little-known piece of folk medicine comes in. How did sailors treat these boils without antibiotics? One common stomach churning remedy was the poultice. A poultice is a soft, moist mass of material, typically of plant-based origin, that is applied to the body to relieve soreness and inflammation. On a ship, the ingredients were whatever was on hand. A favorite was a mixture of hardtack, softened into a paste with water, or even saliva, and then applied to the boil to draw out the infection. Imagine a warm, soggy, weevil-infested biscuit being used as a medical dressing. Other popular ingredients included chewed tobacco or a mash made from the cook's leftover onions. If any were available, these weren't sterile, and their effectiveness was highly questionable, but it was all they had. The universal lack of hygiene among seafarers raises a question that social historians and archaeologists continue to explore. Did this shared experience of filth create a unique social bond? One perspective is that the constant, unavoidable grime was a great equalizer. On a pirate ship, where social hierarchies were already flattened, everyone was equally dirty. The captain might have a private toilet, but his skin was just as salty and chafed as the newest cabin boy's. This shared misery could have fostered a sense of camaraderie and solidarity, a bond forged in mutual discomfort. It's the "we're all in this disgusting boat together" mentality. On the other hand, some scholars argue that the filth exacerbated tensions. In such a close and uncomfortable environment, small annoyances could easily flare into major conflicts. A man who was particularly careless with his waste or who had a particularly bad case of body odor could become a target of ridicule and violence. Instead of uniting them, the grime might have just made a group of already stressed and aggressive men even more irritable and prone to conflict. Was the shared dirt a source of unity or a catalyst for chaos? Without detailed personal diaries from the lower decks, we can only speculate on the social dynamics of stench. You decide against the saltwater bath. The idea of being coated in a crust of salt seems even worse than the film of grime you're currently sporting. You resign yourself to your fate. You are a dirty man, on a dirty ship, in a dirty world. You catch a whiff of your own armpit for the first time. It doesn't smell out of place. It smells like home. In that, you realize, is the most disturbing thought you've had all day. You've come to terms with the smells, the food, and the general lack of cleanliness. You're adapting, but there's a new sensation that's beginning to demand your attention. It starts as a subtle, occasional itch on your scalp, in the small of your back, along the seams of your woolen breeches. You scratch it, and for a moment, it goes away, but then it comes back, more persistent this time, a creeping, crawling feeling that you can't seem to satisfy. One evening, as you're trying to find a comfortable position to sleep on a pile of rough canvas below decks, you feel a distinct tickle in your eyebrow. You reach up and your fingers close around something small. You bring it close to the smoky, flickering light of a nearby lantern. It's a tiny, grayish-white insect, no bigger than a sesame seed. It's a louse, and it's not alone. You, my friend, are infested. This isn't a sign of personal failure or unique misfortune. It's a universal condition of life at sea. Body lice pediculus humanus were as much a part of the crew as the captain or the cook. They lived in the seams of clothing, feeding on human blood. and laying their eggs, or nets, on the fibers of the cloth. In the crowded and giganthic environment of a ship, where men slept packed together for warmth and no one ever washed their clothes, lice spread with unstoppable efficiency. They were a constant, maddening companion. The itching is more than just an annoyance. It's a form of low-grade torture. The relentless need to scratch can disrupt sleep, make it impossible to focus on your duties, and drive a man to distraction. You see veteran sailors who have developed a permanent, unconscious twitch, their hands constantly drifting to their ribs or neck to scratch an itch that never truly goes away. Their skin, particularly around the torso and waist where clothing is tightest, is a mess of red welts, scabs, and angry rashes from the constant scratching. This is a well-documented historical reality. Lice weren't just a minor pest, they were a significant contributor to the misery and poor health of sailors. So, what did they do about it? They couldn't to eliminate the lice, but they did have methods for fighting a desperate, losing battle against them. The most common technique was known as seam squirreling. A sailor would take off his shirt or jacket, turn it inside out, and meticulously hunt for the adult lice and their eggs along the seams. They would kill them one by one, crushing them between their thumbnails with a satisfying, if grim, little pop. It was a tedious, endless task. You could spend an hour delicising your shirt, only to have it infested within a day by your louse-ridden shipmates. This brings us to a strange and little-known fact about this process. Some pirates turned this unpleasant chore into a form of social gambling. A group of men would sit together, each delicising his own shirt. They would place bets on who could find the most lice, or who could find the largest one. It was a grotesque but oddly practical way to pass the time and make a few coins. It turned a miserable necessity into a competitive sport. Imagine a circle of hardened pirates, squinting in the dim light, comparing their catches and arguing over whose louse is the most impressive. It's a bizarre image, but one that speaks to the human ability to find entertainment in even the most disgusting circumstances. The problem with lice, however, goes far beyond ditching ungrim entertainment. Lice are vectors for disease. Specifically, they are the primary carriers of a deadly illness known as epidemic typhus, often called ship fever or gale fever. When a louse bites an infected person, it ingests the Rickettsia proaguesci bacteria. The bacteria multiply in the low uses, gotten are excreted in its feces. When an infected louse bites another person, the person scratches the itchy bite. This action rubs the louse's feces into the tiny wound, transmitting the disease. The symptoms are horrific high fever, severe headache, muscle pain, and a characteristic rash. It was incredibly contagious in crowded conditions and had a high mortality rate. A single sailor coming aboard with typhus could trigger an outbreak that would decimate an entire crew. And this is where a significant historical debate lies: how much of the so-called Golden Age of Piracy was shaped not by battles or naval patrols, but by the humble louse. Some historians argue that typhus was the single greatest threat to any maritime enterprise in this era, far more deadly than cannons or cutlasses. They suggest that many pirate crews who simply vanished at sea weren't lost in storms, but were wiped out by a typhus epidemic, leaving a ghost ship full of the dead to drift aimlessly. In this view, the louse is a major historical actor, a tiny insect that dictated the success and failure of empires and outlaws alike. Other historians, while acknowledging the danger of typhus, argue that its impact on pirates might be overstated. They suggest that pirates, being on smaller, often less crowded ships and with the ability to periodically air out on a deserted island, might have had a lower risk of catastrophic epidemics compared to the massively overcrowded lower decks of a naval man-of-war. Was the pirate ship a floating death trap of fever, or was it, ironically, a slightly healthier environment than the legitimate ships they preyed upon? You lie back down on your makeshift bed, the louse you caught crushed between your fingers, The crawling sensation on your skin is no longer just an itch, it's a threat. Every tickle is a potential harbinger of fever and death. You are not just a host, you are a habitat. These tiny creatures are living on you, eating from you, and using you to travel the world. You close your eyes, but sleep is difficult. The ship is alive with the sounds of creaking wood, snoring men, and the gentle patter of rats in the darkness. And you are alive with the silent, crawling movement of 1,000 tiny passengers. Just as your ear drifting into an uneasy, itchy sleep, your ear startled awake by a frantic scrambling sound, followed by a sharp squeak. In the dim, greasy light from the lantern, you see a sleek, dark-shaped dart across the floor, followed closely by another. They are rats, not small, timid field mice, but big, bold ship rats, ratus, the black rat. They are long, wary, and utterly confident. They move as if they own the place, because in a very real sense, they do. They were here long before you, and they'll be here long after you're gone. The ship is their world, a giant, floating pantry, and you and the rest of the crew are just inconvenient, noisy neighbors. You'll find them everywhere. In the cargo hold, they are a constant, gnawing threat to the provisions. They can chew through a wooden barrel to get at the flour, contaminate sacks of rice with their droppings, and spoil precious supplies of hardtack. The sound of their scratching and gnawing from within the walls of the ship is a constant, unnerving soundtrack to life at sea. A ship infested with rats was a ship that was slowly being eaten from the inside out. This battle between sailors and rats is a cornerstone of maritime history, a conflict as old as seafaring itself. You'll see them on the decks at night, scurrying along the ropes with an agility that rivals the best sailors. You might even wake up to find one sniffing at your face, its whiskers tickling your cheek. The men have a grudging, hateful respect for them. The rats are a pest, a source of filth and disease, but they are also survivors, perfectly adapted to this strange, vertical world. Of course, the rats aren't the only uninvited guests of this size. As you explore the darker, damper corners of the ship, particularly near the galley and the food stores, you'll meet the other major invertebrate inhabitant, the cockroach. They swarm in the shadows, a shimmering, rust-colored carpet of chitin turned over a sack of grain, and dozens of them will scatter in every direction. They get into everything, tainting food with their distinctive, unpleasant odor. Like the rats, they are disgustingly resilient and almost impossible to eradicate. This brings us to a strange and fascinating piece of sailor folklore. While rats were generally hated, they were also seen as a kind of barometer for the ship's health. There was a widespread belief among sailors that rats could sense when a ship was doomed. If a crew saw the ship's entire rat population suddenly trying to abandon ship while in port scurrying down the mooring ropes to the dock, it was considered a terrible omen. It meant the ship was unseaworthy and would likely sink on its next voyage. A rat leaving a sinking ship isn't just a metaphor, it was a literal and deeply feared superstition. So as much as you hate your rodent shipmates, their continued presence is, in a weird way, a comfort. As long as the rats are happy to stay, the ship is probably safe. The presence of rats and cockroaches wasn't just a matter of spoiled food and creepy, crawly feelings. Like the lice on your body, these pests were major vectors for disease. The fleas that lived on the rats were the infamous carriers of the bubonic plague. While the great plagues of the Middle Ages were over, smaller, localized outbreaks still occurred, and the ship was the perfect incubator. A single infected rat coming aboard in a port could carry the seeds of destruction for the entire crew. More commonly, rat urine and droppings could contaminate food and water supplies, spreading diseases like leptopsosis and salmonella, leading to fever, vomiting, and diarrhea ailments that could be deadly on a ship with no medical care. This connection between pests and disease leads to a debate that public health historians and maritime archaeologists are still untangling. What was the primary disease vector on an 18th century ship for a long time? The focus was on specific, dramatic diseases like scurvy from malnutrition or typhus from lice. But a more modern, holistic view argues that we should look at the ship as a complete pathogen ecosystem. In this view, it was just one thing, but the synergistic effect of everything. The rats and cockroaches contaminated the food, weakening the crew with gastrointestinal illnesses. This malnutrition made them more susceptible to scurvy. The weakened, sickly crew were less able to maintain personal hygiene, leading to rampant lice infestations. The lice then spread typhus through the already debilitated population. Is it possible to isolate a single worst offender? Some historians champion the louse as the most direct and deadly killer because of typhus. Others point to the rat, not just for the plague, but for the constant, attritional damage caused by food spoilage and contamination, which created the baseline of poor health. The debate is about whether the acute, epidemic killer, the louse, was more significant than the chronic, systemic problem, the rat. It's a grim accounting of which pest was the pirate's worst enemy. Tonight, however, you're not thinking like a historian. You're thinking like a man who just saw a rat the size of a small cat. You try to go back to sleep, but your ears are now attuned to the secret life of the ship. You hear the faint scratching inside the walls, the skittering of cockroaches in the dark, the distant squeak of a rat in the hold. The ship isn't just a vessel, it's a living organism, and you are just one small part of its complex and thoroughly disgusting food chain. You pull your thin blanket a little tighter, hoping it offers some protection, but knowing, deep down, that it doesn't. The real crew of this ship never sleeps. It's not just the creatures living on the ship that are a problem, it's the ship itself. From a distance, your vessel looks solid, a powerful piece of engineering. But up close, you're starting to see that it's in a constant state of decay. A ship made of wood, floating on salt water, is engaged in a permanent, losing battle against the forces of nature. Your home is actively trying to rot around you. You run your hand along the inside of the hull below decks. The wood is damp to the touch, and it has a spongy, soft feel in places. This is dry rot, or, more accurately, wet rot. It's a fungal decay that thrives in the perpetually damp, poorly ventilated conditions of a ship's lower decks. The fungus sends out microscopic filaments that break down the cellulose in the wood, turning strong oak planks into something with the structural integrity of a damp loaf of bread. A ship's carpenter would spend a significant amount of his time hunting for and cutting out these rotten sections, patching them with new wood. But it was a battle you could never truly win. The rot was always there, lurking in the dark, damp corners. This pervasive dampness is a well-documented aspect of life at sea. Water was everywhere. It seeped through the seams in the hull. It dripped down from the decks after a rain or a large wave, and it condensed on the cold wood in the humid air. The space below decks, where you sleep, never truly dried out. Your bedding is always slightly damp. Your spare clothes, if you have any, will develop a musty smell and patches of mildew. The air itself is heavy, with moisture and the smell of mold. You're living inside a giant, floating terrarium, and everything is slowly turning to mulch. This constant dampness and decay leads to one of the most disgusting and little-known pests aboard a sailing ship, the shipworm. Despite its name, the shipworm is not a worm at all. It's a type of saltwater clam, a bivalve mollusc with a very small shell and a long, soft, naked body. Its scientific name is Teredo navalis, and it was the terror of wooden-hulled ships. The larvae would attach themselves to any submerged wood, and then begin to burrow. They would drill long, winding tunnels through the planks of the hull. The rudder and the keel, using their tiny shells like a drill bit. From the outside, a piece of wood might look perfectly fine, but on the inside, it could be honeycombed with the tunnels of shipworms, destroying its strength and rendering it completely useless. A severe shipworm infestation could literally cause a ship to fall apart at sea. To combat that, shipbuilders would cover the hull below the waterline with a protective layer. In the 17th and 18th centuries, this often consisted of a mixture of tar, horsehair, and sometimes a thin sheathing of lead or copper, though the latter was incredibly expensive. Pirates, who often sailed in stolen, poorly maintained vessels, were particularly vulnerable to the silent, relentless destruction of the shipworm. Finding a good place to careen the ship, beaching it on its side during high tide to expose the hull at low tide was essential. This allowed the crew to scrape off the barnacles and marine growth, and most importantly, to burn and tar the hull to kill the shipworms and seal the wood. The debate among naval historians and archaeologists about shipworms is a fascinating one. How much did this one tiny creature influence the course of history? Some argue that the shipworm was a major limiting factor in the age of discovery and colonial expansion. It dictated the effective range of ships, forced the establishment of careening facilities in distant colonies, and drove the development of expensive and technologically advanced hull sheathing techniques, like copper plating. In this view, the shipworm is a major geopolitical force, a claim that shaped empires. Others argue that while a serious nuisance, its impact is often exaggerated. They point out that sailors and shipwrights were well aware of the problem and had developed effective, if labor-intensive, methods to deal with it. They argue that factors like storms, navigation errors, and disease were far more significant threats to a ship's survival. Was the shipworm a civilization-altering pest, or just another one of the many maintenance headaches of sailing a wooden boat? You're not thinking about geopolitics. You're thinking about the fact that the floor beneath your feet and the walls around you might be riddled with burrowing clams. You look at a damp, discolored plank near your sleeping area. Is it just stained? Or is it oft with rot? Are there things eating it from the inside? The ship groans and creaks with the motion of the waves. Before, it sounded like the voice of adventure. Now, it sounds like the moans of a slowly dying organism. You are a parasite, living on a louse-infested host, which itself is being eaten alive by fungus and clams. The whole enterprise feels deeply, fundamentally unstable. You try to push the thought out of your mind. There's nothing you can do about it. You just have to trust that the carpenter is good at his job, and that the shipworms haven't gotten to the important bits yet. Weeks have passed since you first set foot on this floating piece of rot. You've grown accustomed to the filth, the pests, and the pure food. You've become part of the ship's grimy rhythm. But now, a new and more sinister threat is beginning to make its presence felt, not in the ship, but in your own body and the bodies of the men around you. It starts subtly. You feel a profound sense of exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep can cure. Your muscles ache, and you notice strange, faint bruises appearing on your legs, even though you don't remember bumping into anything. You see a fellow pirate smiling, and you notice that his gums, which were already an unhealthy-looking reed, are now swollen and have a strange, purplish hue. They look like they're trying to grow over his teeth. A few days later, you see him eating his dinner of salted beef, and HES wincing with every chew. His gums have started to bleed. This is the calling card of the most dreaded disease of the age of sail, scurvy. Scurvy is not a germ-based illness, it's a deficiency disease, caused by a lack of vitamin C, ascorbic acid. The human body cannot produce its own vitamin C, so we must get it from our diet, primarily from fresh fruits and vegetables. On a long sea voyage, with a diet consisting almost entirely of salted meat and hardtack, fresh produce was non-existent. After about 6 to 8 weeks, the body's store of vitamin C would be depleted, and the horrifying symptoms would begin to appear. This is a major, undeniable historical fact. Scurvy killed more sailors than all other dangers, combat, storms, and other diseases combined. It's estimated that between the 16th and 19th centuries, scurvy killed over 2 million sailors. You watch as the disease takes hold of the crew. The lethargy gets worse. turning into a debilitating apathy. The men become pale and gaunt. Their gums swell grotesquely, becoming black and spongy. The tissue becomes so fragile that it bleeds at the slightest touch. The breath of a man with advanced scurvy takes on a uniquely foul, putrid odor from the rotting flesh in his mouth. Then comes the most infamous symptom: his teeth start to loosen. The collagen that holds the teeth in their sockets dissolves, and they begin to wobble. Eventually, they can be pulled out with the fingers, with little to no pain. A man could lose all his teeth in a matter of weeks. But it gets worse. The skin becomes dry and rough. The strange bruises, which are actually subcutaneous bleeding, spread across the body. The joints swell and become intensely painful, making it impossible to walk or work. The psychological effects are just as devastating, with sufferers experiencing depression, hysteria, and a complete loss of morale. A ship with a scurvy outbreak was a floating hospital of misery and despair. Now for a truly bizarre, and frankly disturbing, lesser-known symptom of this terrible disease. Scurvy doesn't just affect the skin and gums, it affects all the collagen in your body. Collagen is the connective tissue that holds you together, the glue of your body. It's what your scar tissue is made of. One of the most terrifying effects of advanced scurvy is that old, well-healed wounds can spontaneously reopen. A scar from a sword cut you got 5 years ago could suddenly split open, the flesh parting as if the injury had just happened. A bone that was broken and set a decade earlier could re-break in the exact same spot, without any new trauma. The body literally begins to fall apart, its past injuries returning to haunt it in the most visceral way imaginable. Imagine the psychological horror of watching your own body deconstruct itself, its old repairs failing one by one. The cause and cure for scurvy is a topic of intense historical debate, but not in the way you might think. We know it's vitamin C. The debate is about why it took so long for the authorities to figure it out and implement a solution. The common story is that a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind conducted a famous experiment in 1747, proving that citrus fruits cured scurvy. This is true. However, the British Royal Navy didn't officially mandate a regular ration of lemon juice until 1795, nearly half a century later. Why the delay? Some historians blame bureaucratic inertia and institutional resistance to change. The naval establishment was slow, conservative, and skeptical of new ideas. Others argue that the science wasn't as clear-cut as we now see it. Lind's findings were just one of many competing theories. Other doctors blamed scurvy on bad air, dampness, or even laziness. Furthermore, the logistics of supplying a whole navy with citrus juice were daunting. The juice didn't keep well, and the process of concentrating it into a syrup often destroyed the vitamin C through heat. So, was the delay a case of tragic incompetence and stubbornness, or a more understandable result of the scientific and logistical confusion of the time? The debate highlights the complex relationship between scientific discovery and public policy. As a pirate, you are outside this naval system entirely. Your crew's fate depends on your captain's luck and knowledge. A smart captain knew the value of anti-score, but I see us. Even if he didn't know the science, he would make a point of stopping at islands to gather fresh greens and fruits, and he would prioritize plundering them from other ships. A less knowledgeable captain might sail for months on end, dimming his crew. You look at your own gums in a small, cracked piece of mirror. They look pale. You feel a deep, unsettling fatigue in your bones. Is it starting every ache? Every bruise is now a source of profound anxiety. You are in a race against your own body's chemistry, and the finish line is a gruesome decay. The treasure you seek seems less important now than finding a single, fresh orange. The man with the bleeding gums, the first one you noticed, is now in a terrible state. He can no longer work. He lies on a dirty blanket below decks, a picture of absolute misery. His teeth are gone, and his legs are swollen to twice their normal size. covered in dark, ugly bruises. But today, you notice something new and profoundly disturbing. On his arm, there is a long, pale scar, the relic of an old cutlass wound. Yesterday, it was just a scar. Today, it is an angry red line. And in the middle, the skin has split open, weeping a thin, yellowish fluid. His old wound has come back from the dead. This bizarre and horrifying symptom of scurvy is what we touched on before, but seeing it in person is a different experience entirely. It defies logic. An injury that healed years ago should not simply unheal itself. It's a violation of the natural order of things. The crew gathers around, looking at the man's arm with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. They've all heard the stories, but few have seen it so clearly. The man himself just stares at it with a kind of dull apathy, too sick and exhausted to be properly terrified. This phenomenon, known as score, but I see wound hissance, is a perfect illustration of vitamin C's role in the body. Collagen isn't just for building new tissues, it's also for maintaining existing ones. Scar tissue, while strong, is in a constant, slow state of turnover and repair, just like all the other tissues in your body. It requires a steady supply of vitamin C to maintain its integrity. When that supply is cut off, the maintenance stops. The old, weakened collagen breaks down, and there's no new collagen to replace it. The scar literally dissolves from the inside out, and the wound reopens along the original line of injury. It's a physiological ghost, a memory of trauma made flesh once more. This is a scientifically understood process now, but to a pirate in the 18th century, it must have seemed like a form of dark magic, a curse rising from the sea itself. As the men mutter and look at their own scars with newfound anxiety, the ship's cook, who seems to have an opinion on everything, offers a piece of folk wisdom. He claims that this only happens to wounds that were inflicted by a dishonest blade, meaning a weapon used in an unfair fight or a treacherous attack. It's a way of imposing a moral order on a biological process, a desperate attempt to find meaning in the body's horrifying betrayal. This brings us to a strange and little documented aspect of scurvy's psychological impact. How did sailors cope with the sheer weirdness of the disease while we have many accounts of the physical symptoms? The mental toll is harder to quantify. The reopening of old wounds must have been a source of incredible psychological trauma. It wasn't just a physical ailment, it was an attack on a man's history, on his sense of a stable self. It suggested that the past was not fixed, that old pains could return at any time. Did this lead to a unique form of maritime madness? This is where the historical record gets murky, and it's a subject of debate for medical historians. Were the documented cases of hysteria and melancholy among scurvy victims just a standard psychological response to chronic pain and illness? Or was there something specific about scurvy's bizarre symptoms that caused a unique kind of mental breakdown? Some scholars suggest that the experience of bodily disintegration, losing teeth, skin bruising without cause, old wounds reopening could trigger a form of depersonalization, a feeling that one's own body is alien and hostile. It's a terrifying thought that your own flesh could become your enemy. Others argue that we shouldn't over-psychologize it. These were practical men, and they likely saw it as just another one of the horrible ways the sea could kill you, without delving into its existential implications. The debate centers on how much we can read into the sparse descriptions of sailors' mental states. Were they stoic sufferers, or were they trapped in a uniquely terrifying psychological nightmare? You look at your own hands. You have a small, silvery scar on your thumb from a childhood accident with a fishing knife. It's been there for as long as you can remember, a part of you. Now, you can't help but see it as a potential fault line, a place where your body might one day decide to split open. The physical discomforts of this life, the hunger, the itch, the grime are one thing. You can get used to them, but this is different. This is a new kind of fear, a deep, internal dread that comes from the knowledge that the very stuff you are made of is unreliable. The ship is rotting around you, and now you have proof that your own body can't, and will do the same. The journey for golden glory has become a race to find a patch of land with a lemon tree before you literally fall apart at the seams. The man with the reopened wound is getting worse, and another man has a leg so swollen and black it looks like a piece of charred timber. This specter of scurvy is now a full-blown reality. But life at sea doesn't stop for sickness. The ship still needs to be sailed, and the daily, dangerous work continues. One morning, during a sudden squall, a sailor high up on the mast loses his footing on a wet rope. He falls, not into the sea, but onto the deck below. There's a sickening crack as his leg bone shatters upon impact. He screams, a piercing sound of agony. The crew rushes to his side. His lower leg is bent at an unnatural angle, the sharp end of the broken bone threatening to pierce through the skin. It's a compound fracture, a devastating injury on land, and a near-certain death sentence at sea. There are no doctors or surgeons aboard this pirate ship. So, who do you call? The answer is as practical as it is terrifying. You call the man who is best with a saw, the ship's carpenter. The carpenter, a grim, quiet man whose primary job is to fix the rotting ship, is now expected to fix a rotting or broken man. On many ships, and particularly on pirate vessels that couldn't afford a dedicated surgeon, the role of medical officer fell to either the carpenter or the cook. The logic was brutally simple. The carpenter had the sharpest saws and knew how to cut through tough material, be it wood or bone. The cook, on the other hand, had the strongest stomach, being accustomed to butchering animals, and he controlled the galley's fire, which was needed to heat up tar or cauterizing irons. In this case, the carpenter is the designated sawbones. This is a well-established historical fact, the conflation of these trades out of grim necessity. The term sawbones itself became a common slang for any surgeon, a nod to the brutal, carpentry-like nature of their work in the pre-anesthetic era. The pirate code you signed even acknowledged this reality. It listed specific payments for the loss of limbs, implicitly understanding that amputation was the most likely outcome for any serious injury to an arm or a leg. The carpenter arrives, wiping his hands on his breeches. He carries his toolbox with him. He examines the man's leg, his face unreadable. After a moment, he shakes his head. The break is too severe, too close to the knee. There's no way to set it. If they leave it, the man will die of gangrene, a painful, stinking death. There is only one option: amputation. Now, for a peculiar and rather grim detail about the hierarchy of this impromptu surgery. Who makes the final call? You might think it's the captain, or the makeshift surgeon himself. But on a pirate ship, with its democratic principles, the decision often rested with the crew, and specifically, the quartermaster. The quartermaster was the crew's representative, the man who handled disputes and discipline. A decision as drastic as amputation, which would render a man unable to work and thus eligible for a large payout from the common purse, according to the articles, was a collective concern. The quartermaster consults with the carpenter, and then with the injured man himself, who, through waves of pain, can only nod his consent. The decision is made. The leg has to go. This practice leads to a complex debate among historians about the nature of power and consent on a pirate ship. Was this consultation a genuine act of democratic concern for the individual's well-being and rights, or was it a cold, financial calculation? A man with a mangled leg is a drain on resources. A man with one leg, who survives, is a huge liability from the shared treasury. Some historians argue that the pirate articles, and the processes they created, represent a revolutionary form of social insurance and workers' rights. Far ahead of their time, they protected the injured and ensured they were cared for. Others take a more cynical view. They argue that these were pragmatic rules designed to maintain crew cohesion. A man was more willing to risk his life in battle if he knew his potential injuries were insured. The debate boils down to whether we should view the pirate ship as a proto-socialist commune or a brutally efficient corporation of criminals? Was the decision to amputate an act of mercy or a risk management strategy? The crew prepares for the operation. They carry the screaming man to the main deck, where there is more light and air. They lash him to a table. There is no anesthetic, no sterile operating theater. There is only the carpenter, his saw, a bucket of tar heating over a fire, and a bottle of rum. The carpenter selects a saw from his toolbox. It's the same one he uses to cut planks and spars. He takes a long swig of rum and offers the bottle to the injured man. "Drink," he says. "Drink it all. The operation is about to begin. Then you have a front row seat." The preparations for the amputation are a study in grim efficiency. The scene is set not in a quiet, clean room, but in the open air of the main deck, surrounded by the everyday chaos of the ship. A few of the strongest crew members are tasked with holding the man down. His screams have subsided into a kind of whimpering moan, his body trembling with shock and pain. The bottle of rum he was given is now empty. It won't kill the pain, not even close, but it might dull his senses enough to prevent him from dying of pure shock on the table. The carpenter, our reluctant surgeon, lays out his tools on a piece of canvas next to the table. This is his medical kit, and it's a horrifying sight. There are no delicate, specialized surgical instruments. There is a large, coarse-toothed saw for the bone. There is a wicked-looking curved knife, the kind used for cutting rope or canvas, which will be used for the flesh. There are a few iron probes, normally used for checking for rot in timber, which will now be used for probing a wound. And, perhaps most disturbingly, there is a collection of hooks and smaller knives, which look suspiciously like the tools the cook uses for butchering fish. This is the central, terrifying truth of pre-modern surgery. It was a brutal, bloody affair, barely distinguishable from carpentry or butchery. There is nothing sterile here. The tools are wiped on a dirty rag, but they are covered in the rust, tar, and grime of their everyday use. The concept of germ theory is more than a century away. No one here understands that invisible microbes can cause infection. They believe that infection, or putrefaction, is caused by bad air or an imbalance of the body's humors. Their only concern is to get the limb off as quickly as possible and to stop the bleeding. This is where we encounter a strange and fascinating detail about the ship's surgeon. Be he a carpenter or a captured doctor, what was in their actual, official medicine chest, if they were lucky enough to have won historical records from captured ships, give us a good idea. Besides the brutal cutting tools, a typical sea-going medicine chest would contain a variety of substances that range from the somewhat effective to the utterly useless. You'd find mercury, which was a common and horrifically toxic treatment for venereal disease. You'd find purgative and emetics, designed to make a man vomit or have diarrhea, based on the belief that you needed to purge the body of bad humors. You might find opium in the form of laudanum, one of the few effective painkillers they possessed, but it was used sparingly. And you'd find a host of herbal remedies, whose effectiveness varied wildly, but you would find nothing resembling an antibiotic, an antiseptic, or a proper anesthetic. It was a box of poisons, placebos, and pain. The state of this medical knowledge or lack thereof is at the heart of a long-standing historical debate. Was the official medical practice of the day any better than the folk remedies and brutal pragmatism of a pirate carpenter on one hand? A trained surgeon from London or Paris had a theoretical knowledge of anatomy and a wider range of medicines, however dubious, at his disposal. He might know, for example, to use a tourniquet to reduce blood loss before starting to cut. On the other hand, many of the advanced treatments of the time, like bloodletting, were actively harmful, weakening an already sick or injured patient. A pirate carpenter, with his straightforward, get-it-done approach, might have inadvertently caused less harm than a university-trained doctor with his dangerous theories. Some historians argue that for something like an amputation, The carpenter's speed and the cook's hot tar might have resulted in a higher survival rate than a prolonged, by-the-book procedure that involved bleeding the patient first. It's a grim comparison. Who would you rather have cut off your leg, the ignorant man who might accidentally save you, or the educated man who might scientifically kill you? The carpenter surgeon seems to waste no time on fancy theories. He picks up the curved knife. He takes a deep breath, and the men holding the patient down brace themselves. There is a finality to the moment, a sense of crossing a threshold from which there is no return. The entire crew has gathered to watch. Their face is a mixture of morbid curiosity and empathy. This isn't entertainment, it's a communal ritual of survival. Every man watching knows that the next time, it could be him on that table, his own life, his own limb, could depend on the carpenter's steady hand and the strength of his stomach. The ship rocks gently on the waves. The sun is warm on the deck, and a man is about to be dismembered with a set of woodworking tools. The journey has taken a very dark turn. The quartermaster gives a sharp nod. That's the signal. There is no counting to 3, no gentle preamble. The carpenter leans in, and with a swift, practiced motion, he draws the heavy knife around the man's thigh. Just above the shattered knee, he cuts deep through the skin, fat, and muscle, all in one go. The man on the table, who had been moaning in a drunken stupor, lets out a single, unearthly shriek that silences the gulls overhead. His body convulses, fighting against the men holding him down. The deck around the table is instantly slick with blood. This is the first and most critical step of the amputation, and speed is everything. A surgeon's reputation in this era was built on how quickly he could perform the operation. A good saw bones could have a leg off in under a minute. The longer it took, the more blood the patient lost, and the more likely he was to die from shock. The carpenter works with a grim focus, his face spattered with reed. He uses the knife again to retract the flesh, pulling it back to expose the white of the femur bone. Now comes the saw. He picks it up, positions it on the bone, and begins to cut. The sound is the stuff of nightmares. It's a wet, grating, crunching sound, a noise that will be seared into your memory forever. It's the sound of a man being methodically taken apart. The patient has mercifully passed out from the pain, his head lolling to the side. The carpenter saws with steady, powerful strokes, the same way he would cut a mast to size. Sawdust, mixed with blood and bone marrow, sprays onto the deck. Finally, with the last sharp crack, the bone severs. The lower part of the leg falls to the deck with a soft, heavy thud. The crewmate, looking pale, quickly picks it up and throws it overboard. The sharks that have been following the ship will take care of it. The whole brutal process is a textbook example of the standard surgical procedure of the day, the circular amputation method. Cutting in a circle straight down to the bone was fast but left a messy, hard-to-close wound. A more advanced technique, the flap amputation, involved carving flaps of skin and muscle to be sewn over the stump, but it took longer and was considered riskier. Our carpenter has, wisely or not, chosen speed over elegance. This was the grim reality of surgery before anesthesia and sterile procedure. It was a race against death, fought with brute force and iron will. Now for a little known, and rather macabre, detail concerning the aftermath of these operations. What happened to the amputated limbs? Throwing them overboard was common, but not universal. In the Royal Navy, there are accounts of amputated limbs being collected and placed in a cask or sack. If the man survived, his severed arm or leg would be given a proper burial in a weighted coffin when the ship returned to port. It was seen as a mark of respect, ensuring the man could be whole again for his resurrection on Judgment Day. It's highly unlikely that pirates, with their more pragmatic and less sentimental outlook, would have bothered with such rituals. For them, a severed leg was just another piece of chum. The man on the table is still alive, but he is bleeding profusely from the stump. The main artery, the femoral artery, is pumping blood in terrifying spurts, synchronized with his faint heartbeat. The next few moments will determine if he lives or dies. The carpenter must now stop the bleeding. The primary method was ligation, tying off the blood vessels. He uses one of his probes to fish around in the bloody mess of the stump, trying to isolate the major arteries and veins. He then uses a piece of thread, or suture, to tie them off. It's delicate, horrifying work, like trying to do needlepoint in a hurricane. This leads to a fascinating debate among medical historians. How much anatomical knowledge did a non-professional surgeon like a ship's carpenter actually have? One school of thought suggests they had virtually none. Their knowledge was purely practical and based on experience, perhaps from butchering animals. They knew there were bleeders that had to be stopped, but they wouldn't have known the names of the arteries or the layout of the vascular system. Their success was based on luck and a steady hand. Another school of thought argues that we underestimate the diffusion of knowledge. In a world where public dissections and anatomical illustrations were becoming more common, a curious and intelligent man, even a carpenter, could have picked up a surprising amount of practical anatomical knowledge. Furthermore, many pirates were former naval or merchant sailors, and they would have witnessed amputations before. They might have learned by observation. Was the pirate surgeon a complete amateur, or a surprisingly well-informed layman? The carpenter manages to tie off the biggest bleeders. The gushing has slowed to a steady, oozing seep. The man is pale as death, his breathing shallow. He has survived the cutting, but the most dangerous part is yet to come. The open wound is a gateway for infection, and in this filthy environment, that's almost a certainty. The carpenter's final task is to cleanse the wound and seal it, and he's going to do it with fire and tar. The amputation is complete, but the man on the table is a breath away from death. The bleeding has been slowed, but not stopped. The rough, open stump is a horrifying mess of severed muscle, tissue, and blood. In the modern world, this wound would be meticulously cleaned, stitched closed, and treated with antibiotics. Here, on the deck of a pirate ship, the approach is far more primitive and far more spectacular. The cook, his other duty and the gruesome tag team, brings over a small cauldron from the galley fire. Inside is a thick, black, bubbling liquid tar. The carpenter takes a ladle full of the boiling tar. The heat radiates from it, and the acrid smell fills the air, momentarily overpowering the scent of blood. Without hesitation, he pours the searing hot liquid directly onto the open wound of the stump. The man, who was unconscious, jolts back to life with a convulsive spasm. A terrible, choked scream escapes his lips before he passes out again. The sound of the hot are hitting the raw flesh is a sickening sizzle, and a plume of foul-smelling smoke rises from the wound. The tar instantly sears the smaller blood vessels closed, and the intense heat, they believed, would purify the wound of any lingering poisons. This process is called cauterization. It was the brutal, last resort method for stopping uncontrollable bleeding and, in their view, preventing infection. This is a staple of historical medicine that is as terrifying as it is iconic. The intense pain was considered a necessary evil. If there wasn't available, they might use a specially shaped piece of iron, a cauterizing iron, heated in a fire until it glowed red hot, and then pressed against the wound. The idea was to create a laudable pus, a thick, creamy pus that was believed to be a sign of healthy healing, as opposed to the thin, watery, foul-smelling pus of a truly gangrenous infection. After the cauterization, the stump is a blackened, hideous thing. The carpenter then wraps it tightly with strips of linen probably torn from an old sail or shirt, and certainly not sterile. The operation is over. The man is still breathing. By the standards of the day, it was a success. Now, he just has to survive the almost certain infection and the agonizing recovery. This is where we find a rather strange and unexpected detail about this process. What was the tar they were using? It wasn't the crude petroleum-based asphalt we think of today. It was plain tar, the same sticky, waterproof substance used to preserve the ship's ropes and seal its planks. It was a natural byproduct of slowly burning pine wood in a low-oxygen environment. And here's the fascinating part: modern science has shown that pine actually has some genuine medicinal properties. It is a mild antiseptic and has anti-inflammatory, antifungal, and antibacterial qualities. So, while their reasoning was flawed, they thought the benefit came from the heat, not the substance itself. The pirates' choice of cauterizing agent was accidentally a pretty good one. The tar that kept their ship from rotting was, by sheer coincidence, also helping to keep their wounds from rotting. The use of cauterization versus ligation, tying off blood vessels, was a major point of contention among surgeons of the period, creating a fierce historical debate. The famous 16th century French surgeon Ambroise is often credited with popularizing the use of ligatures as a more humane and effective alternative to mass cauterization. By the 18th century, ligation was considered the more modern and sophisticated technique among educated surgeons. Cauterization was seen as old-fashioned, brutal, and something only a battlefield barber surgeon or a ship's carpenter would resort to. However, some historians argue that in the filthy conditions of a ship, cauterization might have actually been the superior choice. Tying ligatures left fine material the threads inside the wound, which could become a focus for infection. The ligatures themselves were, of course, not sterile. Cauterization, by contrast, sealed the wound completely with a sterile, antiseptic layer of carbonized tissue and tar. It was more destructive to the tissue, but it might have created a more effective barrier against the rampant bacteria of the environment. So, was the pirate carpenter's old-fashioned method actually the better choice for survival in his specific context? Was this a case of brutal pragmatism, once again trumping advanced medical theory? It's a debate about whether the best practice is universal, or if it's entirely dependent on the environment. The crew carries the unconscious man below decks and lays him in a hammock. His chances of survival are slim. He could die from shock, from secondary bleeding, or, most likely, from a raging infection that will set in over the next few days. But for now, he is alive. The carpenter cleans his saw, not with soap, but by scraping off the blood and bone and wiping it with an oily rag. Ready for its next job? Be it cutting wood or flesh. You watch him, and a new level of respect and fear dawns on you. This quiet man who fixes the ship is also the one who takes it apart, piece by piece, man by man, and his toolkit of saws, tar, and fire is the only thing standing between you and a watery grave. The dramatic spectacle of the amputation is over, but the daily, mundane threats to your health are ever present. You start to realize that it's not just the grand, catastrophic injuries you have to fear. It's the small stuff, the tiny, seemingly insignificant wounds that on land would be a minor nuisance, but here at sea can blossom into a death sentence. One afternoon, while helping to mend a frayed rope, you get a splinter in your hand. It's a small, jagged piece of wood, buried deep in the palm of your hand near your thumb. It's painful that you've had splinters before. You try to dig it out with the tip of your knife, but you only manage to push it in deeper. You give up, figuring it will work its way out on its own. This is a grave mistake. Within a day, the area around the splinter is red and swollen. By the second day, it's throbbing with a dull, persistent pain that keeps you up at night. By the third day, your hand has swollen to the size of a small melon, and a red line is beginning to creep up your arm. You have a raging infection. The splinter, covered in the dirt, tar, and bacteria of the rope, has introduced a host of microscopic enemies into your bloodstream. Your body is losing the battle. This is a fundamental aspect of life in this era that is often overlooked in adventure stories. In a world without antibiotics, any break in the skin was a potential doorway to death. A simple cut from a knife while slicing your salted beef, a scraped knuckle from a fall on the deck, even an insect bite that you scratched open with a dirty fingernail, all could lead to salutalize, sepsis, or blood poisoning. or gangrene. The most common and feared infection was tetanus, known as lockerhood for its characteristic symptom of muscle spasms that begin in the jaw. It was almost always fatal. Sailors were particularly vulnerable due to the nature of their work, which involved constant minor cuts and scrapes from rough, dirty materials. You show your swollen hand to the cook, who now seems to be the go-to man for less severe medical advice. As the carpenter is only consulted for sawing matters, the cook examines your hand with a critical eye, then nods grimly. He knows exactly what to do. He disappears into the galley and returns not with a poultice, but with something far more alarming, a live maggot. This brings us to a bizarre and stomach-turning piece of medical history that is, surprisingly, still used today in a refined form: maggot therapy. For centuries, battlefield surgeons and folk healers had observed that wounds which became infested with maggots seemed to heal better and were less likely to develop gangrene than wounds that did not. The observation was correct, even if their understanding of why was not. The maggots, specifically the larvae of certain species of blowflies, consume only the dead, necrotic tissue, leaving the healthy tissue alone. They are tiny, living debriding tentacles. Furthermore, their secretions have antibacterial properties, helping to clean the wound and promote healing. The cook, using a piece of folk wisdom passed down through generations of sailors, places the maggot directly onto the most inflamed part of your hand and covers it with a small, damp piece of cloth. He tells you to leave it there. It is, he assures you, the only thing that will eat the poison. The ethics and efficacy of such folk remedies are a point of endless debate among historians. Was this kind of treatment, born from observation and tradition, a life-saving piece of wisdom, or was it a disgusting, dangerous gamble that only occasionally worked by sheer luck? Some historians argue that these folk practices, honed over centuries, were often more effective and less harmful than the official medicine of the day, which was still reliant on balancing humors and purging the body. They see it as a testament to the practical intelligence of common people. Others argue that for every case where a maggot might have helped, there were likely a dozen where it did nothing, or introduced new infections. They contend that we tend to romanticize folk medicine, remembering the successes and forgetting the many, many failures. It's a debate about the nature of knowledge itself. Is it better to have a correct practice based on a wrong theory, maggots work, but not because they eat poison, or a wrong practice based on a sophisticated theory, bloodletting to balance the humors? You lie in your hammock, the maggot squirming gently on your swollen hand. It's a deeply unsettling sensation, a feeling of being consumed while you are still alive. You are putting your face in a fly larva, a creature born of filth, to save you from an infection caused by a tiny sliver of wood. The grand pirate adventure of your dreams has shrunk down to this silent, desperate partnership with an insect in a battle for your own hand. Every throb of pain is a reminder of your vulnerability. You are not a swashbuckling hero. You are a fragile bag of flesh and blood, floating on a wooden island of splinters and germs, praying that a maggot knows what it's doing. The maggot on your hand may or may not be working its disgusting magic, but a new, more democratic threat is now sweeping through the ship. It begins with one man, then two, then a dozen. They complain of a splitting headache, a high fever, and chills that rack their bodies despite the humid air below decks. Soon, they are too weak to stand, delirious with fever, and covered in a telltale rash of small, red spots. It's ship fever, typhus. The lice have delivered their poison. The lower deck of the ship transforms into a floating infirmary. The air, already thick with the smells of bilge water and unwashed bodies, now carries the sickly sweet scent of feverish sweat and the acrid odor of vomit. The men lie in their hammocks, groaning and muttering in their delirium. There is no way to quarantine the sick. In the cramped, confined space of the ship, everyone is sharing the same air, the same bedding, and the same lice. The disease spreads like fire in a dry forest. This is the nightmare scenario for any vessel in the 18th century, a full-blown epidemic at sea. With so many men incapacitated, the basic functions of the ship become nearly impossible. There aren't enough healthy hands to manage the sails, to stand watch, or to pump the bilge. The ship becomes sluggish and unresponsive, a ghost ship crewed by the sick and the dying. This is a well-documented historical pattern. A ship didn't need to be sunk by a storm or a cannonball to be lost. It could be defeated from within by an enemy too small to see. As if typhus wasn't enough, another scourge often followed in its wake: dysentery, known graphically as the bloody flux. Dysentery is a severe intestinal inflammation, usually caused by bacteria or amoebas in contaminated food or water. The symptoms are brutal: extreme abdominal cramps, fever, and severe diarrhea containing blood and mucus. It is incredibly dehydrating and debilitating. A man already weakened by typhus would have little resistance to a secondary infection like dysentery. The combination was almost always fatal. The ship's head becomes a grim, desperate place, and soon even that small dignity is lost, as men are too weak to make it there. The lower deck becomes a cesspit of human misery and disease. This is where we encounter a small, but fascinating, historical detail about the treatment of these fevers. With no understanding of germs, doctors and healers of the time believed that a fever needed to be sweated out. The treatment for a man burning up with a 100-degree fever was to pile heavy woolen blankets on top of him and give him hot drinks, trying to induce a profuse sweat. In reality, this often just made the fever worse and accelerated the deadly dehydration caused by typhus and dysentery. It was a perfect example of a medical intervention that, despite being well-intentioned, did the exact opposite of what the patient needed. The question of which disease was the true king of the sea is a subject of intense debate among maritime historians and epidemiologists. For centuries, scurvy was seen as the great killer, and its conquest by citrus fruit was hailed as the single greatest triumph of naval medicine. But more recent scholarship has challenged this view. Some historians argue that infectious diseases like typhus and dysentery were actually responsible for far more deaths, but their symptoms were often confused with each other or with the final stages of scurvy. A sailor who died with a fever and rash might be recorded as a victim of fever, without specifying which one. Dysentery was so common it was sometimes seen as just a part of life at sea, not a specific cause of death. This great maritime killer debate asks us to re-evaluate the historical record. Proponents of the infectious disease theory argue that the focus on scurvy is a distortion, a heroic narrative that simplifies a much more complex and dirty reality. They suggest that the real breakthrough in naval health wasn't just the lemon, but the later, more general improvements in hygiene, ventilation, and quarantine procedures championed by figures like Captain Cook and Gilbert Blaine. Opponents argue that while typhus and dysentery were certainly deadly, scurvy was the great enabler. It was the chronic malnutrition from scurvy that weakened the sailors' immune systems, allowing the infectious diseases to take hold and become epidemic. In this view, scurvy was the root cause, the gateway disease that opened the door to all the others. Was the lemon the silver bullet we think it was? Or was it just one small weapon in a much larger war against filth? You lie in your hammock, your own hand throbbing, and listen to the chorus of misery around you. The man in the hammock next to you is delirious, arguing with ghosts. Another is seized by a violent coughing fit. You feel a new tickle in your own throat, a new ache in your bones. Is it just fear? Or is it the beginning of the fever in this floating world of germs? Every breath feels like a gamble. The treasure chest you once dreamed of has been replaced by a much more immediate and terrifying prize. A clean bill of health, and it seems just as unattainable as a chest of gold. After weeks of misery, fever, and the agonizingly slow healing of your hand, a lookout scry electrifies the ship Lin Ho. It's the first sight of solid ground in what feels like an eternity. The destination is the infamous port of Nassau on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas in the early 18th century. This was the heart of the so-called Republic of Pirates, a chaotic, lawless haven where pirates could rest, repair their ships, and spend their ill-gotten gains. For the sick and weary crew, it's a paradise on the horizon, a place with fresh food, clean water, and solid ground that doesn't pitch and roll beneath their feet. As the ship navigates the shallow, turquoise waters and anchors in the bay, you get your first look at this legendary pirate capital. It's not quite the grand city you might have imagined. It's a ramshackle collection of wooden shacks, tents, and a few more substantial buildings, all clustered around a natural harbor. A half-finished fort looms over the town, a testament to some long-forgotten official's ambition. The beaches are littered with the debris of ship repairs and drunken revelries. It looks less like a republican, more like a chaotic, semi-permanent beach party. You and the rest of the surviving crew pile into long boats and head for shore. The feeling of solid earth under your feet is so strange you nearly stumble. The air is warm and filled with new smells, the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and tropical flowers. It's a welcome change from the ship's perpetual stench. The men who can still walk head straight for the nearest tavern, their throats parched for something other than grog made with slimy water. You, desperate for fresh food, find a small market where local women are selling fruits and vegetables. You buy a mango and eat it on the spot, the sweet, juicy flesh feeling like the most luxurious meal of your life. For a moment, it feels like you've made it. You survived. But as you spend more time in Nassau, you begin to realize that you've only traded one type of filth for another. This pirate paradise is a public health nightmare. There is no sanitation system, no garbage disposal, and no source of clean water other than a few wells that are likely contaminated by the town's waste. The streets, such as they are muddy tracks filled with garbage, animal droppings, and human effluent. Flies swarm everywhere. The taverns are packed with drunken, unwashed pirates from a dozen different ships, all sharing diseases as freely as they share rumors of treasure. This is a crucial historical point. Pirate havens like Nassau were not idyllic tropical retreats. They were disease incubators on a massive scale. This is where you encounter a fascinating, and rather disgusting feature of these lawless towns: the unregulated food and drink. The meat roasting over the open pits might be from a stolen pig, or it might be from an animal that died of disease. The water used to brew the beer is likely from the same questionable wells everyone drinks from. And the rum, sold in countless grog shops, is of highly dubious quality. Unscrupulous tavern owners would stretch their rum by adding things like water, molasses, and even gunpowder or chili pepper to give it a kick and mask the taste of cheap, poorly distilled spirits. A night of heavy drinking in Nassau could leave you not just with a hangover, but with a serious case of food poisoning or a raging intestinal parasite. The transient, lawless nature of Nassau raises a significant question for historians and archaeologists who study piracy. Was a place like Nassau a functioning pirate society, or was it merely an anarchic camp? Some scholars, often from a more romantic or libertarian perspective, argue that Nassau was a genuine experiment in self-governance. They point to the pirates' use of their own codes, their election of leaders like a governor, and their creation of a free port outside the control of the European empires. They see that as a libertalia, a free society for the outcasts of the world. Other historians take a much more critical view. They argue that Nassau was simply a chaotic free-for-all, a place of convenience with no real social structure or long-term vision. They point to the rampant violence, the lack of infrastructure, and the fact that the Republic collapsed the moment a real naval authority, in the form of Governor Wood S. Rogers, showed up with a pardon and a few warships. Was Nassau a revolutionary protostate, or just a conveniently located beach to get drunk on between raids? The archaeological evidence from the area is sparse. leaving the true nature of this pirate republic shrouded in myth and debate. You spend a few days in Nassau. Your scurvy begins to recede thanks to the fresh fruit, but you develop a nasty stomach bug from a questionable stew. You see men who survived typhus at sea succumb to a knife fight in a tavern over a game of cards. You see others who were disciplined and defective sailors on the ship become useless. Incoherent drunks on land. The paradise you imagined is proving to be just as dangerous as the hell you left behind. It's cleaner in some ways, and much, much dirtier in others. You start to feel a strange longing for the relative order and predictability of the ship. At least there, you knew who your enemies were: the sea, the shipworms, and the ice. Here, the enemies are smiling at you from across a tavern table, offering to buy you another drink of poison. You've been in Nassau for over a week. The ship has been careening beached on its side, its hull scraped clean of barnacles and shipworms. Then retard. The sick have either recovered or died. The holds, once empty, are now restocked with fresh for now water and provisions. And most importantly, the plunder from your last voyage has been divided. After the shares for the ship's maintenance and the injury fund are set aside, you receive your portion, a small leather bag heavy with Spanish silver coins and a few pieces of gold. It's more money than you've ever held in your life. It's the reason you signed on. This is the moment of triumph. So what do you do with it? Do you buy a small plot of land, invest in a legitimate business, save it for a comfortable future? Now, you're a pirate. You head straight to the nearest tavern and begin to spend it with a reckless abandon that is breathtaking to behold. This is one of the most consistent and well-documented behaviors of pirates during their golden age. They weren't arable with money. The treasure they risked their lives to obtain was often squandered in a matter of days on the most fleeting and self-destructive of pleasures. You watch as your shipmates, rich men one day, or paupers the next, they buy round after round of drinks for the entire tavern. They gamble huge sums on the turn of a card, or the roll of a die, losing a month's earnings in a single drunken bet. They lavish expensive gifts on the tavern wenches and ladies of the night who populate the port, buying silk dresses and jewelry for women whose names they won't remember tomorrow. The prevailing philosophy is simple: live for today, for tomorrow you might be dead. And in their line of work, that wasn't just a cliche, it was a statistical probability. This extravagant, self-destructive spending spree is a core element of the pirate legend. But why did they do it? It seems irrational to risk so much for something you treat so carelessly. Economists and historians have long debated the motivations behind this behavior. The traditional view is that it was a simple reflection of their character. They were impulsive and disciplined men with no thought for the future. They were hedonists, living purely for the moment. Their spending habits were just another symptom of their lawless, chaotic nature. However, a more modern, and perhaps more sympathetic, view sees their behavior as a perfectly rational response to their circumstances. This is where we encounter a fascinating economic concept: the time preference. Time preference is a measure of how much more you value something today compared to in the future. Someone with a low time preference is happy to save for retirement. Someone with a high time preference wants everything now. A pirate had, arguably, the highest time preference of anyone on Earth, with a life expectancy measured in months or a few years. What was the point of saving the chances of being killed in the next battle, succumbing to disease, or being captured and hanged were incredibly high? Saving for a future you would almost certainly not live to see was the irrational choice. Spending everything immediately on the few pleasures available to you was the logical thing to do. This debate over pirate economics, were they impulsive fools or rational actors, is central to understanding their culture. Were their actions driven by a lack of foresight, or by a tragically accurate assessment of their own grim prospects? It's a question of whether their profligacy was a character flaw or a survival strategy for the soul. And here's a quirky detail about what they spent their money on. While much of it went to drink and debauchery, some pirates had more specific and expensive tastes. There are accounts of pirates spending huge sums on the finest clothing, elaborate pistols with silver inlays, or even commissioning custom-made flags. One of the most famous pirates, Bartholomew Black, Bart Roberts, was known for his love of fine, crimson coats and a huge diamond-encrusted cross he wore around his neck. These weren't just functional items, they were status symbols. In a society with few ways to display wealth, wearing your plunder was the most obvious way to show off your success. It was a form of conspicuous consumption that was as loud and defiant as a cannon blast. You find yourself caught up in the frenzy. You buy drinks, you play cards, and you lose more silver than you care to admit. The bag of coins, which felt so heavy and full of promise just a few days ago, is now distressingly light. You've spent a fortune, and what do you have to show for it? A splitting headache, a collection of new and colorful ice, and a vague memory of a good time. You look around the tavern at your shipmates. They are loud, boisterous, and, for the moment, happy, but their wealth is an illusion, a fleeting tide that will recede as quickly as it came in. Soon, the money will be gone, and when it is, there will be only one thing to do: go back to sea and get more. Their lifestyle created its own trap. The spending necessitated more raiding, and the raiding provided the means for more spending. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of violence and excess, and you are now a willing participant. The party in Nassau is over. The money is gone. It's time to go back to sea. As you climb back aboard the ship, you feel a decade older than when you arrived. Your brief foray into civilization has left you exhausted and possibly carrying a few new diseases. You look around at the veteran pirates, the men who have been doing this for a few years, and you begin to see them in a new light. You're not just seeing their scars and missing teeth anymore, you're seeing the deep, cumulative toll this life has taken on their bodies. Let's take a hypothetical old pirate. He's maybe 35 years old. On land, a man of this age would be considered in his prime. At sea, he is an ancient mariner, a gnarled survivor. Let's do a quick physical inventory of what his body has endured. His skin is like cracked leather, permanently weathered by sun, wind, and salt. It's a tapestry of scars, a pale, puckered line on his cheek from a knife fight in Tortuga, a ragged starburst on his forearm from flying splinters during a cannonade, and countless smaller nicks and cuts from years of hard labor. Look at his mouth. He probably has fewer than half of his original teeth. The rest have been lost to decay, bar fights, or most likely, successive bouts of scurvy that loosen them from their sockets. The remaining teeth are yellowed from tobacco and grog, and his gums are a landscape of receding, discolored flesh. His breath, a combination of rotting gums, rum, and poor digestion, is a weapon in itself. His joints are a mess. Years of climbing wet rigging, hauling heavy ropes, and sleeping on hard, damp decks have given him chronic arthritis. His knees, elbows, and knuckles ache with every change in the weather. He moves with a certain stiffness, a hitch in his gait that speaks of old, poorly set fractures and constant, low-grade pain. There's a good chance he's missing a finger or two, lost to an accident or a moment of carelessness. Maybe he even has a more dramatic injury, like the prosthetic hook or wooden peg leg of legend, a constant, cumbersome reminder of a bad day at work. Internally, things are even worse. His liver is likely enlarged and damaged from years of processing vast quantities of alcohol. His lungs are probably scarred from breathing the smoky air below decks and from a lifetime of respiratory infections that never fully healed. His digestive system is in a permanent state of rebellion from a diet of salted meat, weevil-filled biscuits, and whatever contaminated food he could find in port. He likely suffers from chronic stomach ailments and the lingering effects of dysentery. This is a crucial historical point. The diseases of old age came much earlier for men like this. A 35-year-old pirate's body had the wear and tear of a 60 or 70-year-old man from a gentler profession. And here's a little known but devastating detail he's hearing. Life on a pirate ship was incredibly loud. The constant creaking of the ship, the shouting of orders over the howl of the wind, and, most importantly, the deafening roar of cannon fire. Being part of a gun crew, firing broadside after broadside in the heat of battle would do permanent damage to the eardrums. There was no hearing protection. Many veteran pirates would have suffered from significant hearing loss and a constant ringing in their ears tinnitus. It was a hidden disability, another layer of sensory decay. The overall health of the average pirate is a subject of debate among historians, largely due to a lack of data. The traditional view holds that their lives were so brutal and short that they were, on average, far less healthy than their counterparts in the Navy or merchant service. They lived harder, fought more, and died younger. However, some revisionist historians have proposed a healthy soldier effect for pirates. This theory suggests that pirate crews, being self-selecting volunteers, might have started out as a healthier, tougher, and more resilient population than the often malnourished and forcibly pressed crews of naval vessels. A weak or sickly man wouldn't choose to become a pirate, and if he did, he wouldn't last long. Therefore, the surviving veterans might represent a kind of survival of the fittest, men who were constitutionally tougher than average. So, which is it, was the average veteran pirate a broken-down wreck, a testament to the lifestyle's brutality, or was he a hardened Superman, a survivor who had proven his physical superiority? The truth is likely a paradox. He was probably both. He was a man of incredible constitutional toughness who had been systematically broken down by years of abuse, leaving him a wreck who could still, somehow, outfight and outlast almost anyone else. You look at this 35-year-old ancient, and you see your own potential future. It's a grim picture. The promise of gold seems like a poor trade for a body so thoroughly ruined. He catches you staring and gives you a weary, gap-toothed grin. "Don't worry, lad," he rasps, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "The first 10 years are the worst. You're not sure if he's joking, and you're fairly certain you won't be around long enough to find out." The ship is back on the open sea. The brief respite in Nassau is fading. Hung over memory, the familiar, grim routine begins again. The bad food, the foul water, the lice, the rot. The cycle you witnessed from desperation to plunder to excess and back to desperation is the engine that drives this entire enterprise. And as you settle back into the rhythm, you start to understand why the so-called Golden Age of Piracy was so brief. It was just the Royal Navy that ended it. The lifestyle itself was a self-consuming fire. This period, roughly from the 1692 to the late 1722, was a perfect storm of conditions that allowed piracy to flourish. There was a large pool of trained, unemployed, and disgruntled sailors left over from various European wars. The trade routes of the expanding empires were rich with targets, and the colonial governments were often too weak or too corrupt to effectively police their own waters. But the very things that made pirate life attractive were also the things that made it unsustainable. Think about it from a public health perspective, the one you've been living for the past several weeks. The pirate ship is a closed system of disease and decay. The constant threat of scurvy, typhus, dysentery, and infection meant that a pirate crew was in a perpetual state of attrition. Men were always dying, not just in battle, but in their hammocks. A crew that set out with 100 men might return with only 60. Without having fired a single cannon. To continue operating, they constantly needed new recruits. But their reputation for brutality and high mortality made recruitment a difficult proposition. They were burning through their most essential resource, manpower. The economic model was just as flawed. As you saw in Nassau, there was no investment in infrastructure. The money was not used to build better ships, establish secure, defensible bases, or create a sustainable community. It was squandered. The pirate republics were parasitic. They produced nothing. They only took. And like any parasite, if they grew too successful and killed their host, in this case, Maritime trade they would ultimately starve. If they plundered too many ships in one area, trade would dry up or be rerouted, or the navy would finally be sent to deal with them. Their success sowed the seeds of their own destruction. Now for a slightly less obvious, but equally important, factor in their decline: their ships. This is a fascinating detail that is often overlooked. Pirates rarely, if ever, used large, powerful warships like a naval ship of the line. Those were too slow, required huge crews, and were too difficult to maintain. They preferred smaller, faster, more agile vessels like sloops and schooners. These ships were perfect for hit-and-run tactics, but they had a major drawback: they weren't very durable. A wooden ship subjected to the harsh conditions of constant sailing in tropical waters, often with deferred maintenance, undamaged from combat, had a very short lifespan. The shipworms, the rot, the simple wear and tear, it all added up. A pirate crew might use up a ship in just a few years. They would then have to capture a new one. This meant that their entire operation was dependent on constantly finding and stealing their most vital piece of capital equipment. It was an incredibly precarious existence. The brevity of the Golden Age is a subject of great historical discussion. What was the ultimate cause of its demise? The traditional narrative focuses on the renewed power of the British Royal Navy, the appointment of tough governors like Wood S. Rogers, and the systematic hunting down and execution of famous pirate captains. This view emphasizes the role of state power in crushing a lawless rebellion. Another school of thought emphasizes the widespread offering of royal pardons. Many pirates were not die-hard revolutionaries, they were desperate men. When offered a choice between a pardon and a certain noose, many chose the pardon. This view suggests that piracy withered away as much as it was stamped out, as pirates voluntarily rejoined the legitimate world once the opportunity arose. But a third, more holistic view, and the one you've been experiencing firsthand, is that the system was simply, fundamentally, and hygienically unsustainable. The combination of disease, poor diet, reckless spending, and the inherent instability of their social and economic model meant that the Golden Age was destined to be a brief, violent flash in the pan. It wasn't just the Navy that beat them. They were beaten by vitamin C deficiency, by the typhus louse, by liver cirrhosis, and by the simple, inexorable math of a system that consumed more than it created. Was piracy a viable alternative society crushed by empires, or a self-destructive death cult that was doomed to burn itself out? The truth, as you can now attest, is that it was a miserable, dirty, and short-lived way of life that produced a handful of great stories and a great many anonymous, unmarked graves. You look out at the horizon, which no longer seems to hold any promise, only more of the same. The ship creaks beneath you, a little more rotten than it was yesterday. The man next to you coughs, a wet, racking sound. You scratch at a louse bite on your neck. This isn't an adventure, it's a slow-motion suicide pact. And you're starting to wonder if a quick drop from a hangman's rope might not be a mercy compared to this. Years from now, assuming you survive, what will remain of this time? Not the gold that will be long spent, not your health that has been irrevocably broken. What will remain are the stories, the wild, improbable tales of adventure on the high seas. And in the telling, something strange will happen. The filth, the pain, and the misery will begin to fade from memory, polished away like tarnish on a silver coin. You won't tell your grandchildren, if you live to have them, about the taste of slimy water or the constant, maddening itch of lice. You won't describe the sound of a saw cutting through a man's bone or the stench of a deck slick with the effluvia of dysentery. No, you'll tell them about the thrill of the chase, the crash of the cannons, the sight of a Spanish galleon's sails on the horizon. You'll talk about the camaraderie, the brotherhood of outcasts, the defiant freedom of living under your own flag. You'll talk about the sun setting over a turquoise sea and the wild nights of rum and song in Nassau. You will, consciously or not, become an editor of your own life, cutting out the disgusting, terrifying parts and leaving only the romance. This is the process that has shaped our entire modern perception of piracy. The historical reality, as you have so intimately experienced, was brutal, short, and overwhelmingly disgusting. But the legend is one of adventure, rebellion, and freedom. This transformation from filthy reality to romantic myth is perhaps the most fascinating part of the pirate story. It began almost as soon as the Golden Age ended, with books like Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates. This book, a mixture of factual accounts and sensationalized tales, was the bestseller that first defined the pirate archetypes we know today: Blackbird, Calico Jack Rising, then Bonnie, and Mary Red. It was the foundation of the myth. The myth was then picked up and embellished by later writers. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island in the 19th century added some of the most enduring tropes: the treasure map with the X, the one-legged pirate with a parrot on his shoulder. J. Barrie's Peter Pan in the early 20th century gave us the archetypal pirate villain in Captain Hook, turning the pirate into a figure of childhood fantasy. And then, of course, Hollywood took the baton and ran with it. From the swashbuckling films of Errol Flynn to the blockbuster franchise that dominates the modern image of piracy, each retelling sanded away more of the rough edges, made the clothes cleaner, the teeth whiter, and the life more appealing. But here's a quirky detail in that myth-making process. Even as the story was being romanticized, some of the grim reality was preserved in our language. We've talked about how the head became the word for a ship's toilet. The term slush fund has a similarly disgusting origin. Slush was the rendered down fat and grease skimmed from the top of the pots where the salted meat was boiled. It was foul stuff, but it was collected by the ship's cook and sold in port to tallow makers for candles or soap. The money from this illicit side hustle, a fund derived from greasy garbage, became known as a slush fund. The grim reality is baked right into our common phrases, hidden in plain sight. The central question that historians and cultural critics are still debating is why we have chosen to romanticize this specific group of criminals so thoroughly. Why pirates we don't tell rollicking adventure stories about 18th century high wine or romanticize the lives of street thugs from the same period. What is it about pirates that captures our imagination? One theory is that they represent a fantasy of ultimate freedom. In a world that was becoming increasingly organized, regulated, then bureaucratic, the pirate stands as a figure of pure, untamed liberty. He is his own master, unbound by the rules of kings and countries. Another theory is that we project our own anti-authoritarian impulses onto them. They are rebels fighting against the oppressive and exploitative system of the merchant empires. We see them, rightly or wrongly, as proto-revolutionaries, social bandits fighting for the common man. A third, perhaps simpler, theory is that the setting is just inherently romantic. The open ocean, the tropical islands, the sailing ships, it's a perfect stage for adventure, far removed from the mundane reality of our own lives. Is our love affair with the myth of the pirate a harmless fantasy, or does it do a disservice to the historical reality, glossing over the immense suffering, not just of the pirates themselves, but of their countless victims? It's a debate with no easy answer. You are now part of that debate. You are the source material. Your life, in all its grimy detail, is the seed from which the grand, beautiful, and utterly false legend will grow. You are the living embodiment of the gap between the squalor of history and the glory of myth, and as you hoist the sail for another voyage, you can almost feel the disgusting reality of your life starting to dissolve, leaving behind the fate, alluring outline of a story worth telling. A story that is, in almost every important respect, the lie. The creaking of the ship's timbers begins to fade, replaced by a softer, more rhythmic sound. The roll of the deck beneath you slowly stills, and the sharp, salty air softens into the familiar scent of your own pillow. The journey is over. The phantom itch of lice on your skin subsides, and the ache in your bones from the damp sea air finally eases. You are drifting now, not on a turquoise sea, but on the gentle, quiet currents of the edge of sleep. The faces of the crew, once so vivid in their grime and desperation, now blur and recede into the darkness. The roar of the cannon and the shriek of the wounded man are gone, leaving only a soft, peaceful hum in your ears, the weight of the silver in your pocket, the burn of the cheap rum in your throat, the sweet taste of that first mango on the shore. All these sensations dissolve into a comfortable, thoughtless warmth. You have left the 18th century behind. There is no more scurvy, no more rot, no more fear. There is only the steady, gentle rise and fall of your own breathing. You are safe in your own time, in your own bed. The filthy, dangerous world of the past has been put away for the night, transformed into nothing more than a fading story. A whisper in the quiet room. Let the last vestiges of the tale drift away, like a ghost ship disappearing into the fog. Let the darkness be a comfort, a soft blanket. There is nothing more you need to do, nowhere else you need to be. Just rest, just sleep. The end of the article. Good night.